Chapter 14, From the Crow's Nest. And so, after strange delays and through an avenue of doubt and battle, this man from the 19th century came at last to his position at the head of that complex world. At first, when he rose from the long, deep sleep that followed his rescue and the surrender of the council, he did not recognize his surroundings. By an effort, he gained a clue in his mind, and all that had happened came back to him. At first, with a quality of insincerity, like a story heard, like something read out of a book. And even before his memories were clear, the exultation of his escape, the wonder of his prominence, were back on his mind. He was owner of the world, master of the earth. This new great age was in the completest sense his. He no longer hoped to discover his experiences a dream. He became anxious now to convince himself that they were real. An obsequious valet assisted him to dress under the direction of a dignified chief attendant, a little man whose face proclaimed him Japanese, albeit he spoke English like an Englishman. From the latter he learnt something of the state of affairs. Already the revolution was an accepted fact. Already business was being resumed throughout the city. Abroad the downfall of the council had been received for the most part with delight. Nowhere was the council popular, and the 1,000 cities of Western America, after 200 years still jealous of New York, London, and the East, had risen almost unanimously 2 days before at the news of Graham's imprisonment. Paris was fighting within itself. The rest of the world hung in suspense. While he was breaking his fast, the sound of a telephone bell jetted from a corner, and his chief attendant called his attention to the voice of Ostrog making polite inquiries. Graham interrupted his refreshment to reply. Very shortly Lincoln arrived, and Graham at once expressed a strong desire to talk to people, and to be shown more of the new life that was opening before him. Lincoln informed him that in 3 hours' time a representative gathering of officials and their wives would be held in the state apartments of the Wind Vane chief. Graham's desire to traverse the city was, however, at present impossible, because of the enormous excitement of the people. It was, however, quite possible for him to take a bird's-eye view of the city from the crow's nest of the Wind Vane keeper. To this, accordingly, Graham was conducted by his attendant. Lincoln, with a graceful compliment to the attendant, apologized for not accompanying them, on account of the present pressure of his administrative work. Higher even than the most gigantic windwheels hung this crow's nest, a clear 1,000 feet above the roofs, a little disc-shaped speck on a spear of metallic filigree, cable-stayed. To its summit Graham was drawn in a little wire-hung cradle. Halfway down the frail-seeming stem was a light gallery, upon which hung a cluster of tubes. Minute they looked from above, slowly rotating on the ring of its outer rail. These were the specula en rapport with the Wind Vane keeper's mirrors, in one of which Ostrog had shown him the coming of his rule. His Japanese attendant ascended before him, and they spent nearly an hour asking and answering questions. It was a day full of the promise and quality of spring. The touch of the wind warmed. The sky was an intense blue, and the vast expanse of London shone dazzling under the morning sun. The air was clear of smoke and haze, sweet as the air of a mountain glen. Save for the irregular oval of ruins about the House of Council, and the black flag of the surrender that fluttered there, the mighty city seen from above showed few signs of the swift revolution that had, to his imagination, in one night and one day changed the destinies of the world. A multitude of people still swarmed over these ruins, and the huge open-work stagings in the distance from which started in times of peace the service of aeroplanes to the various great cities of Europe and America were also black with the victors. Across a narrow way of planking raised on trestles that crossed the ruins, a crowd of workmen were busy restoring the connection between the cables and wires of the council house and the rest of the city, preparatory to the transfer thither of Ostrog's headquarters from the Wind Vane buildings. For the rest, the luminous expanse was undisturbed. So vast was its serenity in comparison with the areas of disturbance, that presently Graham, looking beyond them, could almost forget the thousands of men lying out of sight in the artificial glare within the quasi-subterranean labyrinth, dead or dying of the overnight wounds, forget the improvised wards with the host of surgeons, nurses, and bearers feverishly busy, forget indeed all the wonder, consternation, and novelty under the electric lights. Down there in the hidden ways of the anthill, he knew that the revolution triumphed, that black everywhere carried the day, black favors, black banners, black festoons across the streets. And out here, under the fresh sunlight, beyond the crater of the fight, as if nothing had happened to the earth, the forest of wind vanes had grown from one or two while the council had ruled, roared peacefully upon their incessant duty. Far away, spiked, jagged, and indented by the wind vanes, the Surrey hills rose blue and faint. To the north and nearer, the sharp contours of Highgate and Muswell Hill were similarly jagged. And all over the countryside he knew on every crest and hill, where once the hedges had interlaced, and cottages, churches, inns, and farmhouses had nestled among their trees, windmills, similar to those he saw, and bearing like them vast advertisements, gaunt and distinctive symbols of the new age, cast their whirling shadows and stored incessantly the energy that flowed away incessantly through all the arteries of the city. And underneath these wandered the countless flocks and herds of the British Food Trust, his property, with their lonely guards and keepers. Not a familiar outline anywhere broke the cluster of gigantic shapes below. St. Paul's he knew survived, and many of the old buildings in Westminster, embedded out of sight, arched over, and covered in among the giant growths of this great age. The Thames, too, made no falling gleam of silver to break the wilderness of the city. The thirsty water mains drank up every drop of its waters before they reached the walls. Its bed and estuary, scoured and sunken, was now a canal of seawater, and a race of grimy bargemen brought the heavy materials of trade from the pool, thereby beneath the very feet of the workers. Faint and dim in the eastward, between earth and sky, hung the clustering masts of the colossal shipping in the pool. For all the heavy traffic, for which there was no need of haste, came in gigantic sailing ships from the ends of the earth, and the heavy goods for which there was urgency in mechanical ships of a smaller, swifter sort. And to the south, over the hills, came vast aqueducts with seawater for the sewers, and in 3 separate directions ran pallid lines, the roads stippled with moving grey specks. On the first occasion that offered, he was determined to go out and see these roads. That would come after the flying ship he was presently to try. His attendant officer described them as a pair of gently curving surfaces 100 yards wide, each one for the traffic going in one direction, and made of a substance called edamite, an artificial substance, so far as he could gather, resembling toughened glass. Along this shot a strange traffic of narrow rubber-shod vehicles, great single wheels, 2- and 4-wheeled vehicles, sweeping along at velocities of from 1 to 6 miles a minute. Railroads had vanished, a few embankments remained as rust-crowned trenches here and there. Some few formed the cores of Edomite ways. Among the first things to strike his attention had been the great fleets of advertisement balloons and kites that receded in irregular vistas northward and southward along the lines of the aeroplane journeys. No great aeroplanes were to be seen. Their passages had ceased, and only one little seeming monoplane circled high in the blue distance above the Surrey hills, an unimpressive soaring speck. A thing Graham had already learnt, and from which he found very hard to imagine, was that nearly all the towns in the country, and almost all the villages had disappeared. Here and there only, he understood, some gigantic hotel-like edifice stood amid square miles of some single cultivation, and preserved the name of a town, as Bournemouth, or Wareham, or Swanage. Yet the officer had speedily convinced him how inevitable such a change had been. The old order had dotted the country with farmhouses, and every 2 or 3 miles was the ruling landlord's estate, and the place of the inn and cobbler, the grocer's shop and church, the village. Every 8 miles or so was the country town, where lawyer, corn merchant, wool stapler, saddler, veterinary surgeon, doctor, draper, milliner, and so forth lived. Every 8 miles, simply because that 8-mile marketing journey, for there and back, was as much as was comfortable for the farmer. But directly the railways came into play, and after them the light railways, and all the swift new motor cars that had replaced wagons and horses, and so soon as the high roads began to be made of wood and rubber and edamite, and all sorts of elastic durable substances, the necessity of having such frequent market towns disappeared, and the big towns grew. They drew the worker with the gravitational force of seemingly endless work, the employer with their suggestion of an endless ocean of labor. And as the standard of comfort rose, as the complexity of the mechanism of living increased, life in the country had become more and more costly, or narrow and impossible. The disappearance of vicar and squire, the extinction of the general practitioner by the city specialist, had robbed the village of its last touch of culture. After telephone, kinematograph, and phonograph had replaced newspaper, book, schoolmaster, and letter, to live outside the range of the electric cables was to live an isolated savage. In the country were neither means of being clothed nor fed, according to the refined conceptions of the time, no efficient doctors for an emergency, no company, and no pursuits. Moreover, mechanical appliances in agriculture made one engineer the equivalent of 30 laborers. So, inverting the condition of the city clerk in the days when London was scarce inhabitable because of the coaly foulness of its air, the laborers now came to the city and its life and delights at night to leave it again in the morning. The city had swallowed up humanity. Man had entered upon a new stage in his development. First had come the nomad, the hunter, then had followed the agriculturists of the agricultural state, whose town and cities and ports were but the headquarters and markets of the countryside. And now, logical consequence of an epoch of invention was this huge new aggregation of men. Such things as these, simple statements of fact, though they were to the contemporary men, strained Graham's imagination to picture, and when he glanced over beyond there, at the strange things that existed on the continent, it failed him altogether. He had a vision of city beyond city, cities on great plains, cities beside great rivers, vast cities along the sea margin, cities girdled by snowy mountains. Over a great part of the earth the English tongue was spoken, taken together with its Spanish-American and Hindu and Negro and Pigden dialects. It was the everyday language of 2/3 of humanity. On the continent, save as remote and curious survivals, 3 other languages alone held sway. German, which reached to Antioch and Genoa and jostled Spanish English at Cadiz, a Gallicized Russian, which met the Indian English in Persia and Kurdistan, and the Pidgin, English in Pekin, and French, still clear and brilliant, the language of lucidity, which shared the Mediterranean with the Indian English and German, and reached through a Negro dialect at the Congo. And everywhere now through the city set earth, saved in the administered black belt territories of the tropics, the same cosmopolitan social organization prevailed, and everywhere from pole to equator his property and his responsibilities extended. The whole world was civilized. The whole world dwelt in cities. The whole world was his property. Out of the dim southwest, glittering and strange, voluptuous, and in some way terrible, shone those pleasure cities of which the kinematograph, phonograph, and the old man in the street had spoken. Strange places reminiscent of the legendary Sybaris, cities of art and beauty, mercenary art and mercenary beauty. Sterile, wonderful cities of motion and music, whither repaired all who profited by the fierce, inglorious, economic struggle that went on in the glaring labyrinth below. Fierce he knew it was, how fierce he could judge from the fact that these latter-day people referred back to the England of the 19th century as the figure of an idyllic, easygoing life. He turned his eyes to the scene immediately before him, trying to conceive the big factories of that intricate maze. Chapter 15. Prominent People. The state apartments of the Wind Vane Keeper would have astonished Graham had he entered them fresh from his 19th century life, but already he was growing accustomed to the scale of the new time. He came out through one of the now familiar sliding panels upon a plateau of landing, at the head of a flight of very broad and gentle steps, with men and women far more brilliantly dressed than any he had hitherto seen, ascending and descending. From this position he looked down a vista of subtle and varied ornament in lustreless white and mauve and purple, spanned by bridges that seemed wrought of porcelain and filigree, and terminating far off in a cloudy mystery of perforated screens. Glancing upward he saw tier above tier of ascending galleries with faces looking down upon him. The air was full of the babble of innumerable voices and of a music that descended from above, a gay and exhilarating music whose source he did not discover. The central aisle was thick with people, but by no means uncomfortably crowded. Altogether, that assembly must have numbered many thousands. They were brilliantly, even fantastically dressed, the men as fancifully as the women, for the sobering influence of the Puritan conception of dignity upon masculine dress had long since passed away. The hair of the men, too, though it was rarely worn long, was commonly curled in a manner that suggested the barber, and baldness had vanished from the earth. Frizzy, straight-cut masses that would have charmed Rossetti abounded, and one gentleman, who was pointed out to Graham under the mysterious title of an amorist, wore his hair in two becoming plaies à la Marguerite. The pigtail was in evidence. It would seem that citizens of Chinese extraction were no longer ashamed of their race. There was little uniformity of fashion apparent in the forms of clothing worn. The more shapely men displayed their symmetry in trunk hose, and here were puffs and slashes, and there a cloak, and there a robe. The fashions of the days of Leo X were perhaps the prevailing influence, but the aesthetic conceptions of the Far East were also patent. Masculine embonpoint, which in Victorian times would have been subjected to the button-pearled, the ruthless exaggeration of tight-legged, tight-armed evening dress, now formed but the basis of a wealth of dignity and drooping folds. Graceful slenderness abounded also. To Graham, a typically stiff man from a typically stiff period, not only did these men seem altogether too graceful in person, but altogether too expressive in their vividly expressive faces. They gesticulated, they expressed surprise, interest, amusement. Above all, they expressed the emotions excited in their minds by the ladies about them with astonishing frankness. Even at the first glance, it was evident that women were in a great majority. The ladies in the company of these gentlemen displayed in dress, bearing, and manner alike less emphasis and more intricacy. Some affected a classical simplicity of robing and subtlety of fold, after the fashion of the first French Empire, and flashed conquering arms and shoulders as Graham passed. Others had closely fitting dresses without seam or belt at the waist, sometimes with long folds falling from the shoulders. The delightful confidences of evening dress had not been diminished by the passage of 2 centuries. Everyone's movements seemed graceful. Graham remarked to Lincoln that he saw men as Raphael's cartoons walking, and Lincoln told him that the attainment of an appropriate set of gestures was part of every rich person's education. The master's entry was greeted with a sort of tittering applause, but these people showed their distinguished manners by not crowding upon him, nor annoying him by any persistent scrutiny as he descended the steps towards the floor of the aisle. He had already learnt from Lincoln that these were the leaders of existing London society. Almost every person there that night was either a powerful official or the immediate connection of a powerful official. Many had returned from the European pleasure cities expressly to welcome him. The aeronautic authorities, whose defection had played a part in the overthrow of the council only second to Graham's, were very prominent, and so too was the wind vane control. Amongst others, there were several of the more prominent officers of the food department. The controller of European piggeries had a particularly melancholy and interesting countenance and a daintily cynical manner. A bishop in full canonicals passed athwart Graham's vision, conversing with a gentleman dressed exactly like the traditional Chaucer, including even the laurel wreath. "Who is that?" he asked almost involuntarily. "The Bishop of London," said Lincoln. "No, the other I mean." "Poet, laureate. You still—" "He doesn't make poetry, of course. He's a cousin of Wotton, one of the councillors, but he's one of the Red Rose Royalists, a delightful club, and they keep up the tradition of these things. Asano told me there was a king. The king doesn't belong. They had to expel him. It's the Stuart blood, I suppose, but really." "Too much?" "Far too much." Graham did not quite follow all this, but it seemed part of the general inversion of the new age. He bowed condescendingly to his first introduction. It was evident that subtle distinctions of class prevailed even in this assembly, that only to a small proportion of the guests, to an inner group, did Lincoln consider it appropriate to introduce him. The first introduction was the master aeronaut, a man whose sun-tanned face contrasted oddly with the delicate complexions about him. Just at present, his critical defection from the council made him a very important person indeed. His manner contrasted very favorably, according to Graham's ideas, with the general bearing. He offered a few commonplace remarks, assurances of loyalty, and frank inquiries about the master's health. His manner was breezy. His accent lacked the easy staccato of latter-day English. He made it admirably clear to Graham that he was a bluff aerial dog. He used that phrase, that there was no nonsense about him, that he was a thoroughly manly fellow and an old-fashioned at that he didn't profess to know much, and that what he did not know was not worth knowing. He made a curt bow, ostentatiously free from obsequiousness, and passed. "I am glad to see that type indoors," said Graham. "Phonographs and kinematographs," said Lincoln, a little spitefully. "He has studied from the life." Graham glanced at the burly form again. It was oddly reminiscent. "As a matter of fact, we bought him," said Lincoln, "partly, and partly he was afraid of Ostrog. Everything rested with him." He turned sharply to introduce the Surveyor General of the public schools. This person was a willowy figure in a blue-gray academic gown. He beamed down upon Graham through pince-nez of a Victorian pattern and illustrated his remarks by gestures of a beautifully manicured hand. Graham was immediately interested in this gentleman's functions and asked him a number of singularly direct questions. The Surveyor General seemed quietly amused at the master's fundamental bluntness. He was a little vague as to the monopoly of education his company possessed. It was done by contract with the syndicate that ran the numerous London municipalities, but he waxed enthusiastic over educational progress since the Victorian times. "We have conquered cram," he said, "completely conquered cram. There is not an examination left in the world. Aren't you glad?" "How do you get the work done?" asked Graham. "We make it attractive as possible, and if it does not attract, then we let it go. We cover an immense field." He proceeded to details, and they had a lengthy conversation. Graham learnt that university extension still existed in a modified form. "There's a certain type of girl, for example," said the Surveyor General, dilating with a sense of his usefulness, "with a perfect passion for severe studies, when they are not too difficult, you know. We cater for them by the thousand. At this moment," he said with a Napoleonic touch, "nearly 500 phonographs are lecturing in different parts of London on the influence exercised by Plato and Swift on the love affairs of Shelley, Hazlitt, and Burns. And afterwards they write essays on the lectures, and the names in order of merit are put in conspicuous places. You see how your little germ has grown? The illiterate middle class of your days is quite passed away." "About the public elementary schools," said Graham, "do you control them?" The Surveyor General did, entirely. Now, Graham, in his later democratic days, had taken a keen interest in these, and his questioning quickened. Certain casual phrases that had fallen from the old man with whom he had talked in the darkness recurred to him. The Surveyor General, in effect, endorsed the old man's words. "We try and make the elementary schools very pleasant for the little children. They will have to work so soon. Just a few simple principles, obedience, industry. You teach them very little. Why should we? It only leads to trouble and discontent. We amuse them. Even as it is, there are troubles, agitations. Where the laborers get the ideas, one cannot tell. They tell one another. They are socialistic dreams, anarchy even. Agitators will get to work among them. I have always taken it, that my foremost duty is to fight against popular discontent. Why should people be made unhappy?" "I wonder," said Graham thoughtfully, "but there are a great many things I want to know." Lincoln, who had stood watching Graham's face throughout the conversation, intervened. "There are others," he said in an undertone. The Surveyor General of Schools gesticulated himself away. "Perhaps," said Lincoln, intercepting a casual glance, "you would like to know some of these ladies?" The daughter of the manager of the piggeries was a particularly charming little person with red hair and animated blue eyes. Lincoln left him a while to converse with her, and she displayed herself as quite an enthusiast for the dear old days, as she called them, that had seen the beginning of his trance. As she talked, she smiled, and her eyes smiled in a manner that demanded reciprocity. "I have tried," she said, "countless times, to imagine those old romantic days, and to you they are memories. How strange and crowded the world must seem to you. I have seen photographs and pictures of the past. The little isolated houses, built on bricks, made out of burnt mud and all black with soot from your fires, the railway bridges, the simple advertisements, the solemn, savage, puritanical men in strange black coats, and those tall hats of theirs, iron railway trains on iron bridges, overhead, horses and cattle, and even dogs running half wild about the streets, and suddenly you have come into this." "Into this," said Graham. "Out of your life, out of all that was familiar." "The old life was not a happy one," said Graham. "I do not regret that." She looked at him quickly. There was a brief pause. She sighed encouragingly. "No?" "No," said Graham. "It was a little life, and unmeaning. But this, we thought the world complex and crowded and civilized enough, yet I see, although in this world I am barely 4 days old, looking back on my own time, that it was a queer, barbaric time, the mere beginning of this new order, the mere beginning of this new order. You will find it hard to understand how little I know." "You may ask me what you like," she said, smiling at him. "Then tell me who these people are. I'm still very much in the dark about them. It's puzzling. Are there any generals? Men in hats and feathers?" "Of course not, no. I suppose they are the men who control the great public businesses. Who is that distinguished-looking man?" "That? He's a most important officer. That is Morden. He is managing director of the Antibilious Pill Department. I have heard that his workers sometimes turn out a myriad pills a day in the 24 hours. Fancy, a myriad. A myriad. No wonder he looks proud," said Graham. "Pills. What a wonderful time it is. That man in purple?" "He's not quite one of the inner circle, you know, but we like him. He's really clever and very amusing. He is one of the heads of the medical faculty of our London University. All medical men, you know, wear that purple. But of course, people who are paid by fees for doing something." She smiled away the social pretensions of all such people. "Are any of your great artists or authors here?" "No authors. They are mostly such queer people, and so preoccupied about themselves, and they quarrel so dreadfully. They will fight, some of them, for precedence on staircases. Dreadful, isn't it? But I think Raysbury, the fashionable capitalotomist, is here from Capri." "Capitalotomist," said Graham. "Ah, I remember, an artist. Why not?" "We have to cultivate him," she said apologetically. "Our heads are in his hands," she smiled. Graham hesitated at the invited compliment, but his glance was expressive. "Have the arts grown with the rest of civilized things?" he said. "Who are your great painters?" She looked at him doubtfully, then laughed. "For a moment," she said, "I thought you meant—" She laughed again. "You mean, of course, those good men you used to think so much of because you could cover great spaces of canvas with oil colors, great oblongs, and people used to put the things in gilt frames and hang them up in rows in their square rooms. We haven't any. People grew tired of that sort of thing." "But what did you think I meant?" She put a finger significantly on a cheek whose glow was above suspicion, and smiled and looked very arch and pretty and inviting. "And here," and she indicated her eyelid. Graham had an adventurous moment, then a grotesque memory of a picture he had somewhere seen of Uncle Toby, and the widow flashed across his mind. An archaic shame came upon him. He became acutely aware that he was visible to a great number of interested people. "I see," he remarked inadequately. He turned awkwardly away from her fascinating facility. He looked about him to meet a number of eyes that immediately occupied themselves with other things. Possibly he colored a little. "Who is that talking with the lady in saffron?" he asked, avoiding her eyes. The person in question, he learnt, was one of the great organizers of the American theaters, just fresh from a gigantic production in Mexico. His face reminded Graham of a bust of Caligula. Another striking-looking man was the black labor master. The phrase at the time made no deep impression, but afterwards it recurred. The black labor master. The little lady, in no degree embarrassed, pointed out to him a charming little woman as one of the subsidiary wives of the Anglican Bishop of London. She added encomiums on the episcopal courage. Hitherto there had been a rule of clerical monogamy. Neither a natural nor an expedient condition of things. Why should the natural development of the affections be dwarfed and restricted because a man is a priest? "And by the by," she added, "are you an Anglican?" Graham was on the verge of hesitating inquiries about the status of a subsidiary wife, apparently a euphemistic phrase, when Lincoln's return broke off this very suggestive and interesting conversation. They crossed the aisle to where a tall man in crimson and two charming persons in Burmese costume, as it seemed to him, awaited him diffidently. From their civilities, he passed to other presentations. In a little while, his multitudinous impressions began to organize themselves into a general effect. At first, the glitter of the gathering had raised all the democratic in Graham. He had felt hostile and satirical, But it is not in human nature to resist an atmosphere of courteous regard. Soon the music, the light, the play of colors, the shining arms and shoulders about him, the touch of hands, the transient interest of smiling faces, the frothing sound of skillfully modulated voices, the atmosphere of compliment, interest, and respect had woven together into a fabric of indisputable pleasure. Graham for a time forgot his spacious resolutions. He gave way insensibly to the intoxication of the position that was conceded him. His manner became more convincingly regal. His feet walked assuredly, the black robe fell with a bolder fold, and pride ennobled his voice. After all, this was a brilliant, interesting world. He looked up and saw passing across a bridge a porcelain, and looking down upon him, a face that was almost immediately hidden. The face of the girl he had seen overnight in the little room beyond the theater after his escape from the council, and she was watching him. For the moment he did not remember when he had seen her, and then came a vague memory of the stirring emotions of their first encounter, but the dancing web of melody about him kept the air of that great marching song from his memory. The lady to whom he talked repeated her remark, and Graham recalled himself to the quasi-regal flirtation upon which he was engaged. Yet, unaccountably, a vague restlessness, a feeling that grew to dissatisfaction came into his mind. He was troubled as if by some half-forgotten duty, by the sense of things important slipping from him amidst this light and brilliance. The attraction that these ladies who crowded about him were beginning to exercise ceased. He no longer gave vague and clumsy responses to the subtly amorous advances that he was now assured were being made to him, and his eyes wandered for another sight of the girl of the first revolt. Where precisely had he seen her? Graham was in one of the upper galleries in conversation with a bright-eyed lady on the subject of Aeronaut. The subject was his choice and not hers. He had interrupted her warm assurances of personal devotion with a matter-of-fact inquiry. He found her, as he had already found several other latter-day women that night, less well-informed than charming. Suddenly, struggling against the eddying drift of nearer melody, the song of the revolt, the great song he had heard in the hall, hoarse and massive, came beating down to him. Ah, now he remembered. He glanced up, startled, and perceived above him an oeil de boeuf, through which this song had come, and beyond, the upper courses of cable, the blue haze, and the pendant fabric of the lights of the public ways. He heard the song break into a tumult of voices and cease. He perceived quite clearly the drone and tumult of the moving platforms and a murmur of many people. He had a vague persuasion that he could not account for, a sort of instinctive feeling that outside in the ways a huge crowd must be watching this place in which their master amused himself. Though the song had stopped abruptly, though the special music of this gathering reasserted itself, the motif of the marching song, once it had begun, lingered in his mind. The bright-eyed lady was still struggling with the mysteries of Edomite when he perceived the girl he had seen in the theater again. She was coming now along the gallery towards him. He saw her first, before she saw him. She was dressed in a faintly luminous gray. Her dark hair about her brows was like a cloud, and as he saw her, the cold light from the circular opening into the ways fell upon her downcast face. The lady in trouble about the Edomite saw the change in his expression and grasped her opportunity to escape. "Would you care to know that girl, sire?" she asked boldly. "She is Helen Wotton, a niece of Ostrog's. She knows a great many serious things. She is one of the most serious persons alive. I am sure you will like her." In another moment, Graham was talking to the girl, and the bright-eyed lady had fluttered away. "I remember you quite well," said Graham. "You were in that little room when all the people were singing and beating time with their feet before I walked across the hall." Her momentary embarrassment passed. She looked up at him, and her face was steady. "It was wonderful," she said, hesitated, and spoke with a sudden effort. All those people would have died for you, sire. Countless people did die for you that night." Her face glowed. She glanced swiftly aside to see that no other heard her words. Lincoln appeared some way off along the gallery, making his way through the press towards them. She saw him and turned to Graham strangely eager, with a swift change to confidence and intimacy. "Sire," she said quickly, "I cannot tell you now and here, but the common people are very unhappy. They are oppressed. They are misgoverned. Do not forget the people who face death that you might live." "I know nothing," began Graham. "I cannot tell you now." Lincoln's face appeared close to them. He bowed in apology to the girl. "You find the new world amusing, sire?" asked Lincoln, with smiling deference, and indicating the space and splendor of the gathering by one comprehensive gesture. "At any rate, you find it changed." "Yes," said Graham, "changed, and yet, after all, not so greatly changed." "Wait till you're in the air," said Lincoln. "The wind has fallen. Even now an aeroplane awaits you." The girl's attitude awaited dismissal. Graham glanced at her face, was on the verge of a question, found a warning in her expression, bowed to her, and turned to accompany Lincoln. Chapter 16. The Monoplane. The flying stages of London were collected together in an irregular crescent on the southern side of the river. They formed 3 groups of 2 each and retained the names of ancient suburban hills or villages. They were named in order: Roehampton, Wimbledon Park, Streatham, Norwood, Blackheath, and Shooter's Hill. They were uniform structures rising high above the general roof surfaces. Each was about 4,000 yards long and 1,000 broad, and constructed of the compound of aluminum and iron that had replaced iron in architecture. Their higher tiers formed an open work of girders, through which lifts and staircases ascended. The upper surface was a uniform expanse, with portions, the starting carriers, that could be raised and were then able to run on very slightly inclined rails to the end of the fabric. Graham went to the flying stages by the public ways. He was accompanied by Asano, his Japanese attendant. Lincoln was called away by Ostrog, who was busy with his administrative concerns. A strong guard of the Windvane police awaited the master outside the Windvane offices, and they cleared a space for him on the upper moving platform. His passage to the flying stages was unexpected. Nevertheless, a considerable crowd gathered and followed him to his destination. As he went along, he could hear the people shouting his name and saw numberless men and women and children in blue come swarming up the staircases in the central path. Gesticulating and shouting, he could not hear what they shouted. He was struck again by the evident existence of a vulgar dialect among the poor of the city. When at last he had ascended, his guards were immediately surrounded by a dense, excited crowd. Afterwards it occurred to him that some had attempted to reach him with petitions. His guards cleared a passage for him with difficulty. He found a monoplane in charge of an aeronaut awaiting him on the westward stage. Seen close, this mechanism was no longer small. As it lay on its launching carrier upon the wide expanse of the flying stage, its aluminum body skeleton was as big as the hull of a 20-ton yacht. Its lateral supporting sails braced and stayed with metal nerves, almost like the nerves of a bee's wing, and made of some sort of glassy, artificial membrane, cast their shadow over many hundreds of square yards. The chairs for the engineer and his passengers hung free to swing by a complex tackle within the protecting ribs of the frame and well abaft the middle. The passenger's chair was protected by a wind guard and guarded about with metallic rods carrying air cushions. It could, if desired, be completely closed in, but Graham was anxious for novel experiences and desired that it should be left open. The aeronaut sat behind a glass that sheltered his face. The passenger could secure himself firmly in his seat, and this was almost unavoidable on landing, or he could move along by means of a little rail and a rod to a locker at the stem of the machine, where his personal luggage, his wraps, and restoratives were placed, and which also, with the seats, served as a make-weight to the parts of the central engine that projected to the propeller at the stern. The flying stage about him was empty save for Asano and their suite of attendants. Directed by the aeronaut, he placed himself in his seat. Asano stepped through the bars of the hull and stood below on the stage, waving his hand. He seemed to slide along the stage to the right and vanish. The engine was humming loudly, the propellers spinning, and for a second the stage and the buildings beyond were gliding swiftly and horizontally past Graham's eye. Then these things seemed to tilt up abruptly. He gripped the little rods on either side of him instinctively. He felt himself moving upward, heard the air whistle over the top of the windscreen. The propeller screw moved round with powerful rhythmic impulses. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, 3, which the engineer controlled very delicately. The machine began a quivering vibration that continued throughout the flight, and the roof areas seemed running away to starboard very quickly, and growing rapidly smaller. He looked from the face of the engineer through the ribs of the machine. Looking sideways, there was nothing very startling in what he saw. A rapid, funicular railway might have given the same sensations. He recognized the council house and the Highgate Ridge, and then he looked straight down between his feet. For a moment, physical terror possessed him, a passionate sense of insecurity. He held tight. For a second or so, he could not lift his eyes. Some 100 feet or more sheer below him was one of the big wind vanes of southwest London, and beyond it, the southernmost flying stage crowded with little black dots. These things seemed to be falling away from him. For a second, he had an impulse to pursue the earth. He set his teeth, he lifted his eyes by a muscular effort, and the moment of panic passed. He remained for a space with his teeth set hard, his eyes staring into the sky. Throb, 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 beat, went the engine. Throb, 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 beat. He gripped his bars tightly, glanced at the aeronaut, and saw a smile upon his sun-tanned face. He smiled in return, perhaps a little artificially. A little strange at first, he shouted, before he recalled his dignity, but he dared not look down again for some time. He stared over the aeronaut's head to where a rim of vague blue horizon crept up the sky. For a little while he could not banish the thought of possible accidents from his mind. Throb, 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 beat. Suppose some trivial screw went wrong in that supporting engine. Suppose. He made a grim effort to dismiss all such suppositions. After a while, they did at least abandon the foreground of his thoughts, and up he went steadily, higher and higher into the clear air. Once the mental shock of moving unsupported through the air was over, his sensations ceased to be unpleasant, became very speedily pleasurable. He had been warned of air sickness, but he found the pulsating movement of the monoplane as it drove up the faint southwest breeze was very little in excess of the pitching of a boat head-on to broad rollers in a moderate gale, and he was constitutionally a good sailor. And the keenness of the more rarefied air into which they ascended produced a sense of lightness and exhilaration. He looked up and saw the blue sky above fretted with cirrus clouds. His eye came cautiously down through the ribs and bars to a shining flight of white birds that hung in the lower sky. For a space he watched these, then going lower and less apprehensively, he saw the slender figure of the wind-vane keeper's crow's nest shining golden in the sunlight and growing smaller every moment. As his eye fell with more confidence now, there came a blue line of hills, and then London, already to leeward, an intricate space of roofing. Its near edge came sharp and clear and banished his last apprehensions in a shock of surprise, for the boundary of London was like a wall, like a cliff, a steep fall of 300 or 400 feet, a frontage broken only by terraces here and there, a complex, decorative facade. That gradual passage of town into country through an extensive sponge of suburbs, which was so characteristic a feature of the great cities of the 19th century, existed no longer. Nothing remained of it here but a waste of ruins, variegated and dense with thickets of the heterogeneous growths that had once adorned the gardens of the belt, interspersed among leveled brown patches of sown ground and verdant stretches of winter greens, the latter even spread among the vestiges of houses, but for the most part the reefs and skerries of ruins, the wreckage of suburban villas, stood among their streets and roads, queer islands amidst the leveled expanses of green and brown, abandoned indeed by the inhabitants years since, but too substantial, it seemed, to be cleared out of the way of the wholesale horticultural mechanisms of the time. The vegetation of this waste undulated and frothed amid the countless cells of crumbling house walls, and broke along the foot of the city wall in a surf of bramble, and holly and ivy and teasel and tall grasses. Here and there gaudy pleasure palaces towered amidst the puny remains of Victorian times, and cableways slanted to them from the city. That winter day they seemed deserted. Deserted, too, were the artificial gardens among the ruins. The city limits were indeed as sharply defined as in the ancient days when the gates were shut at nightfall, and the robber foemen prowled to the very walls. A huge semicircular throat poured out of vigorous traffic upon the Edomite Bath Road. So the first prospect of the world beyond the city flashed on Graham and dwindled. And when at last he could look vertically downward again, he saw below him the vegetable fields of the Thames Valley, innumerable minute oblongs of ruddy brown, intersected by shining threads, the sewage ditches. His exhilaration increased rapidly, became a sort of intoxication. He found himself drawing deep breaths of air, laughing aloud, desiring to shout. After a time, that desire became too strong for him, and he shouted. They curved about towards the south. They drove with a slight list to leeward, and with a slow alternation of movement, first a short, sharp ascent, and then a long downward glide that was very swift and pleasing. During these downward glides, the propeller was inactive altogether. These ascents gave Graham a glorious sense of successful effort. The descents through the rarefied air were beyond all experience. He never wanted to leave the upper air again. For a time, he was intent upon the landscape that ran swiftly northward beneath him. Its minute, clear detail pleased him exceedingly. He was impressed by the ruin of the houses that had once dotted the country, by the vast treeless expanse of country from which all farms and villages had gone, save for the crumbling ruins. He had known the thing was so, but seeing it so was an altogether different matter. He tried to make out familiar places within the hollow basin of the world below, but at first he could distinguish no data now that the Thames Valley was left behind. Soon, however, they were driving over a sharp chalk hill that he recognized as the Guildford's Hog's Back. Because of the familiar outline of the gorge at its eastward end, and because of the ruins of the town that rose steeply on either lip of this gorge. And from that he made out other points, Leith Hill, the sandy wastes of Aldershot, and so forth. Save where the broad Eadhamite Portsmouth Road, thickly dotted with rushing shapes, followed the course of the old railway, the gorge of the way was choked with thickets. The whole expanse of the Downs escarpment, so far as the grey haze permitted him to see, was set with windwheels to which the largest of the city was but a younger brother. They stirred with a stately motion before the southwest wind, and here and there were patches dotted with the sheep of the British Food Trust, and here and there a mounted shepherd made a spot of black. Then rushing onto the stern of the monoplane came the Wealden Heights, the line of Hindhead, Pitch Hill, and Leith Hill, with a second row of windwheels that seemed striving to rob the downland whirlers of their share of breeze. The purple heather was speckled with yellow gorse, and on the farther side a drove of black oxen stampeded before a couple of mounted men. Swiftly these swept behind, and dwindled and lost color, and became scarce moving specks that were swallowed up in a haze. And when these had vanished in the distance, Graham heard a peeweet wailing close at hand. He perceived that he was now above the South Downs, and staring over his shoulder saw the battlements of Portsmouth Landing Stage, towering over the ridge of Portsdown Hill. In another moment, there came into sight a spread of shipping like floating cities, the little white cliffs of the Needles, dwarfed and sunlit, and the grey and glittering waters of the narrow sea. They seemed to leap the Solent in a moment, and a few seconds the Isles of Wight was running past. And then beneath him spread a wider and wider extent of sea, here purple with the shadow of a cloud, here grey, here a burnished mirror, and here a spread of cloudy greenish blue. The Isle of Wight grew smaller and smaller, and in a few more minutes a strip of grey haze detached itself from other strips that were clouds, descended out of the sky, and became a coastline. Sunlit and pleasant, the coast of northern France. It rose, it took colour, became definite and detailed, and the counterpart of the downland of England was speeding by below. In a little time, as it seemed, Paris came above the horizon, and hung there for a space, and sank out of sight again as the monoplane circled about to the north. But he perceived the Eiffel Tower still standing, and beside it, a huge dome surmounted by a pinpoint colossus, and he perceived too, though he did not understand it at the time, a slanting drift of smoke. The aeronaut said something about trouble in the underways that Graham did not heed, but he marked the minarets and towers and slender masses that streamed skyward above the city wind vanes, and he knew that in the matter of grace at least Paris still kept in front of her larger rival. And even as he looked, a pale blue shape ascended very swiftly, and the city like a dead leaf driving up before a gale. It curved round and soared towards them, growing rapidly, larger and larger. The aeronaut was saying something. "What?" said Graham, loth to take his eyes from this. "London aeroplane, sire," bawled the aeronaut, pointing. They rose and curved about northward as it drew nearer. Nearer it came, and nearer, larger and larger. The throb, throb, throb beat of the monoplane's flight that had seemed so potent and so swift suddenly appeared slow by comparison with this tremendous rush. How great the monster seemed, how swift and steady. It passed quite closely beneath them, driving along silently, a vast spread of wire-netted translucent wings, a thing alive. Graham had a momentary glimpse of the rows and rows of wrapped-up passengers slung in their little cradles behind windscreens, of a white-clothed engineer crawling against the gale along a ladderway, of spouting engines beating together, of the whirling windscrew, and of a wide waste of wing. He exulted in the sight, and in an instant the thing had passed. It rose slightly, with their own little wings swaying in the rush of its flight. It fell and grew smaller. Scarcely had they moved, as it seemed, before it was again only a flat blue thing that dwindled in the sky. This was the aeroplane that went to and fro between London and Paris. In fair weather and in peaceful times it came and went 4 times a day. They beat across the channel, and slowly, as it seemed, now to Graham's enlarged ideas, and Beachy Head rose greyly to the left of them. "Land," called the aeronaut, his voice small against the whistling of the air over the windscreen. "Not yet," bawled Graham, laughing. "Not land yet. I want to learn more of this machine." "I meant," said the aeronaut. "I want to learn more of this machine," repeated Graham. "I'm coming to you," he said, and he had flung himself free of his chair and taken a step along the guarded rail between them. He stopped for a moment, and his color changed, and his hands tightened. Another step, and he was clinging close to the aeronaut. He felt a weight on his shoulders, the pressure of the air. His hat was a whirling speck behind. The wind came in gusts over his windscreen and blew his hair in streamers past his cheek. The aeronaut made some hasty adjustments for the shifting of the centers of gravity and pressure. "I want to have these things explained," said Graham. "What do you do when you move that engine forward?" The aeronaut hesitated, then he answered, "They are complex, sire." "I don't mind," shouted Graham. "I don't mind." There was a moment's pause. "Aeronautics is the secret, the privilege. I know, but I'm the master and I mean to know." He laughed, full of this novel realization of power that was his gift from the upper air. The monoplane curved about, and the keen, fresh wind cut across Graham's face, and his garment lugged at his body as the stem pointed round to the west. The 2 men looked into each other's eyes. "Sire, there are rules." "Not where I am concerned," said Graham. "You seem to forget." The aeronaut scrutinized his face. "No," he said, "I do not forget, sire. But in all the earth, no man who is not a sworn aeronaut has ever a chance. They come as passengers." "I have heard something of the sort, but I'm not going to argue these points. Do you know why I have slept for 200 years? To fly." "Sire," said the aeronaut, "the rules. If I break the rules." Graham waved the penalties aside. "Then if you will watch me." "No," said Graham, swaying and gripping tight as the machine lifted its nose again for an ascent. "That's not my game. I want to do it myself. Do it myself if I smash for it. No, I will. See, I'm going to clamber by this, to come and share your seat. Steady. I mean to fly of my own accord if I smash at the end of it. I will have something to pay for my sleep. Of all other things, in my past it was my dream to fly. Now, keep your balance." "A dozen spies are watching me, sire." Graham's temper was at end. Perhaps he chose it should be. He swore. He swung himself round the intervening mass of levers, and the monoplane swayed. "Am I master of the earth," he said, "or is your society? Now, take your hands off those levers and hold my wrists. Yes, so. And now, how do we turn her nose down to the glide?" "Sire," said the aeronaut. "What is it? You will protect me?" "Lord, yes, if I have to burn London. Now." And with that promise, Graham bought his first lesson in aerial navigation. "It's clearly to your advantage, this journey," he said with a loud laugh, for the air was like strong wine. "To teach me quickly and well, do I pull this? Ah, so, hello! Back, sire, back! Back, right! 1, 2, 3, good God, up she goes, but this is living!" And now the machine began to dance the strangest figures in the air. Now it would sweep round a spiral of scarcely 100 yards diameter, now rush up into the air and swoop down again, steeply, swiftly, falling like a hawk, to recover in a rushing loop that swept it high again. In one of these descents, It seemed driving straight at the drifting park of balloons in the southeast, and only curved about and cleared them by a sudden recovery of dexterity. The extraordinary swiftness and smoothness of the motion, the extraordinary effect of the rarefied air upon his constitution threw Graham into a careless fury. But at last a queer incident came to sober him, to send him flying down once more to the crowded life below with all its dark insoluble riddles. As he swooped came a tap and something flying past, and a drop like a drop of rain. Then, as he went on down, he saw something like a white rag whirling down in his wake. "What was that?" he asked. "I did not see." The aeronaut glanced and then clutched at the lever to recover, for they were sweeping down. When the monoplane was rising again, he drew a deep breath and replied, "That," and he indicated the white thing still fluttering down, "was a swan." "I never saw it," said Graham. The aeronaut made no answer, and Graham saw little drops upon his forehead. They drove horizontally while Graham clambered back to the passenger's place out of the lash of the wind, and then came a swift rush down, with the wind screw whirling to check their fall, and the flying stage growing broad and dark before them. The sun, sinking over the chalk hills in the west, fell with them, and left the sky a blaze of gold. Soon men could be seen as little specks. He heard a noise coming up to meet him, a noise like the sound of waves upon a pebbly beach, and saw that the roofs about the flying stage were dense with his people rejoicing over his safe return. A black mass was crushed together under the stage, a darkness stippled with innumerable faces, and quivering with the minute oscillation of waved white handkerchiefs and waving hands. Chapter 17. 3 Days. Lincoln awaited Graham in an apartment beneath the flying stages. He seemed curious to learn all that had happened, pleased to hear of the extraordinary delight and interest which Graham took in flying. Graham was in a mood of enthusiasm. "I must learn to fly," he cried. "I must master that. I pity all poor souls who have died without this opportunity. The sweet, swift air. It is the most wonderful experience in the world." "You will find our new times full of wonderful experiences," said Lincoln. "I do not know what you will care to do now. We have music that may seem novel." "For the present," said Graham, "flying holds me. Let me learn more of that. Your aeronaut was saying there is some trades union's objection to one's learning." "There is, I believe," said Lincoln. "But for you, if you would like to occupy yourself with that, we can make you a sworn aeronaut tomorrow." Graham expressed his wishes vividly and talked of his sensations for a while. "And as for affairs," he asked abruptly, "how are things going?" Lincoln waved affairs aside. "Ostrog will tell you that tomorrow," he said. "Everything is settled down. The revolution accomplishes itself all over the world. Friction is inevitable here and there, of course, but your rule is assured. You may rest secure with things in Ostrog's hands." "Would it be possible for me to be made a sworn aeronaut, as you call it, forthwith, before I sleep?" said Graham, pacing. "Then I could be at it the very first thing tomorrow again." "It would be possible," said Lincoln thoughtfully. "Quite possible. Indeed, it shall be done," he laughed. "I came prepared to suggest amusements, but you found one for yourself. I will telephone to the aeronautical offices from here, and we will return to your apartments in the wind vane control. By the time you have dined, the aeronauts will be able to come. You don't think that after you have dined, you might prefer—" He paused. "Yes," said Graham. "We have prepared a show of dancers. They have been brought from the Capri Theater." "I hate ballets," said Graham shortly. "Always did. That's not what I want to see. We had dancers in the old days. For the matter of that, they had them in ancient Egypt, but flying." "True," said Lincoln, "though our dancers—" "They can afford to wait," said Graham. "They can afford to wait. I know I'm not a Latin. There's questions I want to ask some expert about your machinery. I'm keen. I want no distractions." "You have the world to choose from," said Lincoln. "Whatever you want is yours." Asano appeared, and under the escort of a strong guard, they returned through the city streets to Graham's apartments. Far larger crowds had assembled to witness his return than his departure had gathered, and the shouts and cheering of these masses of people sometimes drowned Lincoln's answers to the endless questions Graham's aerial journey had suggested. At first, Graham had acknowledged the cheering and cries of the crowd by bows and gestures, but Lincoln warned him that such a recognition would be considered incorrect behavior. Graham, already a little wearied by rhythmic civilities, ignored his subjects for the remainder of his public progress. Directly they arrived at his apartments, Asano departed in search of kinematographic renderings of machinery in motion, and Lincoln dispatched Graham's commands for models of machines and small machines to illustrate the various mechanical advances of the last 2 centuries. The little group of appliances for telegraphic communication attracted the master so strongly that his delightfully prepared dinner, served by a number of charmingly dexterous girls, waited for a space. The habit of smoking had almost ceased from the face of the earth, but when he expressed a wish for that indulgence, inquiries were made, and some excellent cigars were discovered in Florida and sent to him by pneumatic dispatch while the dinner was still in progress. Afterwards came the Aeronauts and a feast of ingenious wonders in the hands of a latter-day engineer. For the time, at any rate, the neat dexterity of counting and numbering machines, building machines, spinning machines, patent doorways, explosive motors, grain and water elevators, slaughterhouse machines, and harvesting appliances was more fascinating to Graham than any bayadere. "We were savages," was his refrain. "We were savages. We were in the Stone Age compared with this, and what else have you?" There came also practical psychologists with some very interesting developments in the art of hypnotism. The names of Milne Bramwell, Fechner, Liebald, William James, Myers and Gurney, he found, bore a value now that would have astonished their contemporaries. Several practical applications of psychology were now in general use. It had largely superseded drugs, antiseptics, and anesthetics in medicine, was employed by almost all who had any need of mental concentration. A real enlargement of human faculties seemed to have been effected in this direction. The feats of calculating boys, the wonders, as Graham had been wont to regard them, of mesmerizers, were now within the range of anyone who could afford the services of a skilled hypnotist. Long ago, the old examination methods in education had been destroyed by these expedients. Instead of years of study, candidates had substituted a few weeks of chances, and during the chances, expert coaches had simply to repeat all the points necessary for adequate answering, adding a suggestion for the post-hypnotic recollection of these points. In process mathematics particularly, this aid had been of singular service, and it was now invariably invoked by such players of chess and games of manual dexterity as were still to be found. In fact, all operations conducted under finite rules of a quasi-mechanical sort, that is, were now systematically relieved from the wanderings of imagination and emotion, and brought to an unexampled pitch of accuracy. Little children of the laboring classes, so soon as they were of sufficient age to be hypnotized, were thus converted into beautifully punctual and trustworthy machine-minders, and released forthwith from the long thoughts of youth. Aeronautical pupils who gave way to giddiness could be relieved from their imaginary terrors. In every street were hypnotists ready to print permanent memories upon their mind. If anyone desired to remember a name, a series of numbers, a song, or a speech, it could be done by this method, and conversely, memories could be effaced, habits removed, or desires eradicated. A sort of psychic surgery was, in fact, in general use. Indignities, humbling experiences were thus forgotten. Widows would obliterate their previous husbands. Angry lovers released themselves from their slavery. To graft desires, however, was still impossible, and the facts of thought transference were yet unsystematized. The psychologists illustrated their expositions with some astounding experiments in mnemonics made through the agency of a troupe of pale-faced children in blue. Graham, like most of the people of his former time, distrusted the hypnotist, or he might then and there have erased his mind of many painful preoccupations. But in spite of Lincoln's assurances, he held to the old theory that to be hypnotized was in some way to surrender of his personality, the abdication of his will. At the banquet of wonderful experiences that was beginning, he wanted very keenly to remain absolutely himself. The next day and yet another day passed in such interests as these. Each day Graham spent many hours in the glorious entertainment of flying. On the third, he soared across Middle France and within sight of the snow-clad Alps. These vigorous exercises gave him restful sleep. He recovered almost wholly from the spiritless anemia of his first awakening, and whenever he was not in the air and awake, Lincoln was assiduous in the cause of his amusement. All that was novel and curious in contemporary invention was brought to him, until, at last, his appetite for novelty was well nigh glutted. One might fill a dozen inconsecutive volumes with the strange things they exhibited. Each afternoon he held his court for an hour or so. He found his interest in his contemporaries becoming personal and intimate. At first he had been alert chiefly for unfamiliarity and peculiarity. Any foppishness in their dress, any discordance with his preconceptions of nobility in their status and manners had jarred upon him. And it was remarkable to him how soon that strangeness and the faint hostility that arose from it disappeared. How soon he came to appreciate the true perspective of his position and see the old Victorian days remote and quaint. He found himself particularly amused by the red-haired daughter of the manager of the European piggeries. On the second day after dinner, he made the acquaintance of a latter-day dancing girl and found her an astonishing artist. And after that, more hypnotic wonders. On the third day, Lincoln was moved to suggest that the master should repair to a pleasure city. But this Graham declined, nor would he accept the services of the hypnotists in his aeronautical experiments. The link of locality held him to London. He found a delight in topographical identifications that he would have missed abroad. Here, or 100 feet below here, he could say, I used to eat my midday cutlets during my London University days. Underneath here was Waterloo and the tiresome hunts for confusing trains. Often I have stood waiting down there, bag in hand, and stared up into the sky above the forest of signals, little thinking I should walk some day 100 yards in the air. And now in that very sky that was once a gray smoke canopy, I circle in a monoplane. During those 3 days, Graham was so occupied with these distractions that the vast political movements in progress outside his quarters had but a small share of his attention. Those about him told him little. Daily came Ostrog, the boss, his grand vizier, his mayor of the palace, to report in vague terms the steady establishment of his rule. A little trouble, soon to be settled in this city, a slight disturbance in that. The song of the social revolt came to him no more. He never learned that it had been forbidden in the municipal limits, and all the great emotions of the crow's nest slumbered in his mind. But on the second and third of the 3 days he found himself, in spite of his interest, in the daughter of the pig manager, or, it may be by reason of the thoughts her conversation suggested, remembering the girl Helen Wotton, who had spoken to him so oddly at the Windvane's Keeper gathering. The impression she had made was a deep one, albeit the incessant surprise of novel circumstances had kept him from brooding upon it for a space. But now her memory was coming to its own. He wondered what she had meant by those broken, half-forgotten sentences. The picture of her eyes and the earnest passion of her face became more vivid as his mechanical interests faded. Her slender beauty came compellingly between him and certain immediate temptations of a noble passion. But he did not see her again until 3 full days were past. Chapter 18. Graham Remembers. She came upon him at last in a little gallery that ran from the Windvane offices towards his state apartments. The gallery was long and narrow, with a series of recesses, each with an arched fenestration that looked upon a court of palms. He came upon her suddenly in one of these recesses. She was seated. She turned her head at the sound of his footsteps and started at the sight of him. Every touch of color vanished from her face. She rose instantly, made a step toward him as if to address him, and hesitated. He stopped and stood still, expectant. Then he perceived that a nervous tumult silenced her, perceived, too, that she must have sought speech with him to be waiting for him in this place. He felt a regal impulse to assist her. "I have wanted to see you," he said. "A few days ago, you wanted to tell me something. You wanted to tell me of the people. What was it you had to tell me?" She looked at him with troubled eyes. "You said the people were unhappy?" For a moment, she was silent still. "It must have seemed strange to you," she said abruptly. "It did, and yet it was an impulse." "Well, that is all." She looked at him with a face of hesitation. She spoke with an effort. "You forget," she said, drawing a deep breath. "What?" "The people." "Do you mean—" "You forgot the people." He looked interrogative. "Yes, I know you are surprised, for you do not understand what you are. You do not know the things that are happening." "Well?" You do not understand. Well, not clearly, perhaps, but tell me. She turned to him with sudden resolution. It is so hard to explain. I have meant to, I've wanted to, and now I cannot. I am not ready with words, but about you there is something. It is wonder, your sleep, your awakening. These things are miracles, to me at least, and to all the common people. You who lived and suffered and died, you who were a common citizen, wake again, live again, to find yourself master almost of the earth. Master of the earth, he said, so they tell me, but try and imagine how little I know of it. Cities, trusts, the labor department, principalities, powers, dominions, the power and the glory, yes, I have heard them shout, I know I am master, king, if you wish, with Ostrog, the boss. He paused. She turned upon him and surveyed his face with a curious scrutiny. Well? He smiled. To take the responsibility. That is what we have begun to fear. For a moment she said no more. So, she said slowly, you will take the responsibility. You will take the responsibility. The people look to you. She spoke softly. Listen. For at least half the years of your sleep, in every generation, multitudes of people, in every generation, greater multitudes of people, have prayed that you might awake. Prayed. Graham moved to speak and did not. She hesitated, and a faint color crept back to her cheek. Do you know that you would have been to myriads, King Arthur, Barbarossa, the king who would come in his own good time and put the world right for them? I suppose the imagination of the people. Have you not heard our proverb? When the sleeper wakes, while you lay insensible and motionless there, thousands came, thousands. Every first of the month you lay in state, with a white robe upon you, and the people filed by you. When I was a little girl, I saw you like that, with your face white and calm. She turned her face from him and looked steadfastly at the painted wall before her. Her voice fell. When I was a little girl, I used to look at your face. It seemed to me fixed and waiting, like the patience of God. That is what we thought of you, she said. That is how you seemed to us. She turned shining eyes to him. Her voice was clear and strong. In the city, in the earth, a myriad men and women are waiting to see what you will do, full of strange, incredible expectations. Yes? Ostrog, no one can take that responsibility. Graham looked at her in surprise, and her face lit with emotion. She seemed at first to have spoken with an effort and to have fired herself by speaking. Do you think, she said, that you who have lived that little life so far away in the past, you who have fallen into and risen out of this miracle of sleep, do you think that the wonder and reverence and hope of half the world has gathered about you only that you may live another little life? That you may shift the responsibility to any other man? I know how great this kingship of mine is, he said haltingly. I know how great it seems, but is it real? It is incredible, it's dreamlike. Is it real, or is it only a great delusion? It is real, she said, if you dare. After all, like all kingship, my kingship is belief. It is an illusion in the minds of men. If you dare, she said. But countless men, she said, and while it is in their minds, they will obey. But I know nothing. That is what I had in mind. I know nothing. And these others, the counselors, Ostrog, they are wiser, cooler. They know so much, every detail. And indeed, what are these miseries of which you speak? What am I to know? Do you mean? He stopped blankly. I am still hardly more than a girl, she said, but to me the world seems full of wretchedness. The world has altered since your day, altered very strangely. I have prayed that I might see you and tell you these things. The world has changed, as if a canker had seized it and robbed life of everything worth having. She turned a flushed face upon him, moving suddenly. Your days were the days of freedom. Yes, I have thought. I have been made to think, for my life has not been happy. Men are no longer free, no greater, no better than the men of your time. That is not all. This city is a prison. Every city now is a prison. Mammon grips the key in his hand. Myriads, countless myriads, toil from the cradle to the grave. Is that right? Is that to be forever? Yes, far worse than in your time. All about us, beneath us, sorrow and pain. All the shallow delight of such life as you find about you is separated by just a little from a life of wretchedness beyond any telling. Yes, the poor know it. They know they suffer. These countless multitudes who faced death for you 2 nights since, you owe your life to them." "Yes," said Graham slowly. "Yes, I owe my life to them." "You come," she said, "from the days when this new tyranny of the cities was scarcely beginning. It is a tyranny, a tyranny. In your days the feudal warlords had gone, and the new lordship of wealth had still to come. Half the men in the world still lived out upon the free countryside. The cities had still to devour them. I have heard the stories out of the old books. There was nobility. Common men led lives of love and faithfulness. Then they did 1,000 things, and you come from that time. It was not, but never mind. How is it now? Gain and the pleasure cities, or slavery, unthanked, unhonored slavery." "Slavery," he said. "Slavery. You don't mean to say that human beings are chattels?" "Worse. That is what I want you to know and what I want you to see. I know you do not know. They will keep these things from you. They will take you presently to a pleasure city. But you have noticed men and women and children in pale blue canvas with thin yellow faces and dull eyes?" "Yes, everywhere, speaking a horrible dialect, coarse and weak." "I have heard it. They are the slaves, your slaves. They are the slaves of the Labor Department you own." "The Labor Department? In some way, that is familiar. Ah, now I remember. I saw it when I was wandering about the city after the lights returned. Great fronts of building colored pale blue. Do you really mean?" "Yes. How can I explain it to you? Of course, the blue uniform struck you. Nearly a third of our people wear it. More assume it now every day. This Labor Department has grown imperceptibly." "What is this Labor Department?" asked Graham. "In the old times, how did you manage with starving people?" "There was a workhouse, which the parish has maintained." "Workhouse? Yes, there was something in our history lessons. I remember now. The Labor Department ousted the workhouse. It grew, partly, out of something. You perhaps may remember it, an emotional religious organization called the Salvation Army that became a business company. In the first place, it was almost a charity, to save people from workhouse rigors. There had been a great agitation against the workhouse. Now I come to think of it, it was one of the earliest properties your trustees acquired. They bought the Salvation Army and reconstructed it as this. The idea in the first place was to organize the labor of starving homeless people." "Yes. Nowadays there are no workhouses, no refugees and charities, nothing but that department. Its offices are everywhere. That blue is its color. And any man, woman, or child who comes to be hungry and weary, and with neither home nor friend nor resort, must go to the department in the end, or seek some way of death. The euthanasia is beyond their means. For the poor there is no easy death. And at any hour in the day or night there is food, shelter, and a blue uniform for all comers. That is the first condition of the department's incorporation, and in return for a day's shelter, the department extracts a day's work, and then returns the visitor's proper clothing and sends him or her out again." "Yes. Perhaps that does not seem so terrible to you. In your time, men starved in your streets. That was bad. But they died, men. These people in blue. The proverb runs, blue canvas, once and ever. The department trades in their labor, and it has taken care to assure itself of the supply. People come to it starving and helpless. They eat and sleep for a night and day. They work for a day, and at the end of the day, they go out again. If they have worked well, they have a penny or so, enough for a theater, or a cheap dancing place, or a kinematograph story, or a dinner, or a bet. They wander about after that is spent. Begging is prevented by the police of the ways. Besides, no one gives. They come back again the next day or the day after, brought back by the same incapacity that brought them first. At last their proper clothing wears out, or their rags get so shabby that they are ashamed. Then they must work for months to get fresh, if they want fresh. A great number of children are born under the department's care. The mother owes them a month thereafter. The children they cherish and educate until they are 14, and they pay 2 years' service. You may be sure these children are educated for the blue canvas, and so it is the department works." "And none are destitute in the city?" "None. They are either in blue canvas or in prison. We have abolished destitution. It is engraved upon the department's checks." "If they will not work?" "Most people will work at that pitch, and the department has powers. There are stages of unpleasantness in the work, stoppage of food, and a man or woman who has refused to work once is known by a thumb marking system in the department's offices over all the world. Besides, who can leave the city poor? To go to Paris costs 2 lions, and for insubordination there are the prisons, dark and miserable, out of sight below. There are prisons now for many things. And a third of the people wear this blue canvas. More than a third, toilers living without pride or delight or hope, with the stories of pleasure cities ringing in their ears, mocking their shameful lives, their privations and hardships, too poor even for euthanasia, the rich man's refuge from life. Dumb, crippled millions, countless millions, all the world about, ignorant of anything but limitations and unsatisfied desires. They are born, they are thwarted, and they die. That is the state to which we have come. For a space, Graham sat downcast. But there has been a revolution, he said. All these things will be changed. Ostrog. That is our hope. That is the hope of the world. But Ostrog will not do it. He's a politician. To him it seems things must be like this. He does not mind. He takes it for granted. All the rich, all the influential, all who are happy come at last to take these miseries for granted. They use the people in their politics. They live in ease by their degradation. But you who come from a happier age, it is to you the people look, to you. He looked at her face. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. He felt a rush of emotion. For a moment he forgot this city. He forgot the race and all those vague remote voices in the immediate humanity of her beauty. But what am I to do? He said with his eyes upon her. Rule, she answered, bending towards him and speaking in a low tone. Rule the world as if it's never been ruled, for the good and happiness of men. For you might rule it, you could rule it. The people are stirring. All over the world the people are stirring. It wants but a word from you to bring them all together. Even the middle sort of people are restless, unhappy. They are not telling you the things that are happening. The people will not go back to their drudgery. They refuse to be disarmed. Ostrog has awakened something greater than he dreamt of. He has awakened hopes. His heart was beating fast. He tried to seem judicial, to weigh considerations. They only want their leader, she said. And then? You could do what you would. The world is yours. He sat, no longer regarding her. Presently he spoke. The old dreams, and the only thing I have dreamt, liberty, happiness, are they dreams? Could one man, his voice sank and ceased, not one man, but all men, give them only a leader to speak the desire of their hearts? He shook his head, and for a time there was silence. He looked up suddenly, and their eyes met. I have not your faith, he said. I have not your youth. I am here with powers that mocks me. No, let me speak. I want to do. Not right, I have not the strength for that, but something rather right than wrong. It will bring no millennium, but I am resolved now that I will rule. What you have said has awakened me. You are right. Ostrog must know his place, and I will learn. One thing I promise you, this labor slavery shall end. And you will rule? Yes, provided there is one thing. Yes? That you will help me. I, a girl. Yes, does it not occur to you I am absolutely alone? She started, and for an instant her eyes had pity. Need you ask whether I will help you? She said. There came a tense silence, and then the beating of a clock striking the hour, and Graham rose. Even now, he said, Ostrog will be waiting. He hesitated, facing her. When I have asked him certain questions, there is much I do not know. It may be that I will go to see with my own eyes the things of which you have spoken, and when I return, I shall know of your going and your coming, and I will wait for you here again. They regarded one another steadfastly, questioningly, and then he turned from her towards the wind vane office. Chapter 19. Ostrog's Point of View. Graham found Ostrog waiting to give a formal account of his day's stewardship. On previous occasions he had passed over this ceremony as speedily as possible in order to resume his aerial experiences, but now he began to ask quick, short questions. He was very anxious to take up his empire forthwith. Ostrog brought flattering reports of the development of affairs abroad. In Paris and Berlin, Graham perceived that he was saying there had been trouble, not organized resistance indeed, but insubordinate proceedings. After all these years, said Ostrog, when Graham pressed inquiries, the commune has lifted its head again. That is the real nature of the struggle, to be explicit. But order had been restored in these cities. Graham, the more deliberately judicial for the stirring emotions he felt, asked if there had been any fighting. A little, said Ostrog, in one quarter only, but the Senegalese division of our African Agricultural Police, the Consolidated African Companies, have a very well-drilled police, was ready, and so were the aeroplanes. We expected a little trouble in the continental cities and in America, but things are very quiet in America. They are satisfied with the overthrow of the council for the time. Why should you expect trouble? Asked Graham abruptly. There is a lot of discontent, social discontent. The Labor Department? You are learning, said Ostrog with a touch of surprise. Yes, it is chiefly the discontent with the Labor Department. It was that discontent supplied the motive force of this overthrow, that and your awakening. Yes? Ostrog smiled. He became explicit. We had to stir up their discontent. We had to revive the old ideals of universal happiness, all men equal, all men happy, no luxury that everyone may not share, ideas that have slumbered for 200 years. You know that? We had to revive these ideals, impossible as they are, in order to overthrow the council. And now? Well, a revolution is accomplished and the council is overthrown, and people whom we have stirred up remain surging. There was scarcely enough fighting. We made promises, of course. It is extraordinary how violently and rapidly this vague, out-of-date humanitarianism has revived and spread. We who sowed the seed even have been astonished. In Paris, as I say, we have had to call in a little external help. And here? There is trouble. Multitudes will not go back to work. There is a general strike. Half the factories are empty and the people are swarming in the ways. They are talking of a commune. Men in silk and satin have been insulted in the streets. The blue canvas is expecting all sorts of things from you. Of course, there is no need for you to trouble. We are setting the babble machines to work with counter-suggestions in the cause of law and order. We must keep the grip tight. That is all. Graham thought he perceived a way of asserting himself, but he spoke with restraint. Even to the pitch of bringing a Negro police, he said. They are useful, said Ostrog. They are fine, loyal brutes with no wash of ideas in their heads, such as our rabble has. The council should have had them as police of the ways, and things might have been different. Of course, there is nothing to fear except rioting and wreckage. You can manage your own wings now, and you can soar away to Capri if there is any smoke or fuss. We have the pull of all great things. The aeronauts are privileged and rich, the closest trade unions in the world, and so are the engineers of the wind vanes. We have the air, and the mastery of the air is the mastery of the earth. No one of any ability is organizing against us. They have no leaders, only the sectional leaders of the secret society we organized before your very opportune awakening. Mere busybodies and sentimentalists they are, and bitterly jealous of each other. None of them is man enough for a central figure. The only trouble will be a disorganized upheaval. To be frank, that may happen, but it won't interrupt your aeronautics. The days when the people can make revolutions are past. I suppose they are, said Graham. I suppose they are. He mused. This world of yours has been full of surprises to me. In the old days, we dreamt of a wonderful democratic life, of a time when all men would be equal and happy. Ostrog looked at him steadfastly. The day of democracy is past, he said, past forever. That day began with the bowmen of Crécy. It ended when marching infantry, when common men and masses ceased to win the battles of the war, when costly cannon, great ironclads, and strategic railways became the means of power. Today is the day of wealth. Wealth now is power as it never was before. It commands earth and sea and sky. All power is for those who can handle wealth. On your behalf, you must accept facts, and these are facts. The world for the crowd as ruler. Even in your days, that creed had been tried and condemned. Today, it has only one believer, a multiplex, silly one, the man in the crowd. Graham did not answer immediately. He stood lost in somber preoccupations. No, said Ostrog, the day of the common man is past. On the open countryside, one man is as good as another, or nearly as good. The earlier aristocracy had a precarious tenure of strength and audacity. They were tempered. They were insurrections, duels, riots. The first real aristocracy, the first permanent aristocracy, came in with castles and armor and vanished before the musket and the bow. But this is the second aristocracy, the real one. Those days of gunpowder and democracy were only an eddy in the stream. The common man is now a helpless unit. In these days, we have this great machine of the city and an organization complex beyond his understanding. Yet, said Graham, there is something resists, something you are holding down, something that stirs and presses. You will see, said Ostrog, with a forced smile that would brush these difficult questions aside. I have not roused the force to destroy myself, trust me. I wonder, said Graham. Ostrog stared. Must the world go this way? Said Graham, with his emotions at the speaking point. Must it indeed go in this way? Have all our hopes been in vain? What do you mean? Said Ostrog. Hopes? I come from a democratic age, and I find an aristocratic tyranny. Well, but you are the chief tyrant. Graham shook his head. Well, said Ostrog, take the general question. It is the way that change has always traveled. Aristocracy, the prevalence of the best, the suffering and extinction of the unfit, and so to better things. But aristocracy, these people I met. Oh, not those, said Ostrog. But for the most part, they go to their death. Vice and pleasure, they have no children. That sort of stuff will die out. If the world keeps to one road, that is, if there is no turning back. An easy road to excess, convenient euthanasia for the pleasure seekers singed in the flame, that is the way to improve the race. Pleasant extinction, said Graham. Yet, he thought for an instant, there is that other thing, the crowd, the great mass of poor men. Will that die out? That will not die out, and it suffers. Its suffering is a force that even you... Ostrog moved impatiently, and when he spoke rather less evenly than before. Don't trouble about these things, he said. Everything will be settled in a few days now. The crowd is a huge, foolish beast. What if it does not die out? Even if it does not die, it can still be tamed and driven. I have no sympathy with servile men. You heard those people shouting and singing 2 nights ago? They were taught that song. If you had taken any man there in cold blood and asked why he shouted, he could not have told you. They think they are shouting for you, that they are loyal and devoted to you. Just then, they were ready to slaughter the council. Today, they are already murmuring against those who have overthrown the council. No, said Graham. They shouted because their lives were dreary, without joy or pride, and because in me, they hoped. And what was their hope? What is their hope? What right have they to hope? They work ill and they want the reward of those who work well. The hope of mankind, what is it? That someday the overman may come? That someday the inferior, the weak, and the bestial may be subdued or eliminated? Subdued if not eliminated? The world is no place for the bad, the stupid, the enervated. Their duty, it's a fine duty too, is to die. The death of the failure, that is the path by which the beast rose to manhood, by which man goes on to higher things. Ostrog took a pace, seemed to think, and turned on Graham. I can imagine how this great world state of ours seems to a Victorian Englishman. You regret all the old forms of representative government. Their spectres still haunt the world, the voting councils and parliaments, and all that 18th century tomfoolery. You feel moved against our pleasure cities. I might have thought of that had I not been busy. But you will learn better. The people are mad with envy. They would be in sympathy with you. Even in the streets now, they clamor to destroy the pleasure cities. But the pleasure cities are the excretory organs of the state, attractive places that year after year draw together all that is weak and vicious, and all that is lascivious and lazy, all the easy roguery of the world to a graceful destruction. They go there, they have their time, they die childless. All the pretty, silly, lascivious women die childless, and mankind is the better. If the people were sane, they would not envy the rich their way of death. And you would emancipate the silly, brainless workers that we have enslaved and try to make their lives easy and pleasant again, just as they have sunk to what they are fit for. He smiled a smile that irritated Graham oddly. You will learn better. I know these ideas. In my boyhood, I read your Shelley and I dreamt of liberty. There is no liberty, save wisdom and self-control. Liberty is within, not without. It is each man's own affair. Suppose, which is impossible, that these swarming, yelping fools in blue get the upper hand of us, what then? They will only fall to other masters. So long as there are sheep, nature will insist on beasts of prey. It would mean but a few 100 years' delay. The coming of the aristocrat is fatal and assured. The end will be the overman. For all the mad protests of humanity, let them revolt, let them win and kill me and my like. Others will arise, other masters, the end will be the same. I wonder, said Graham doggedly. For a moment he stood downcast. But I must see these things for myself, he said, suddenly assuming a tone of confident mastery. Only by seeing can I understand. I must learn. That is what I want to tell you, Ostrog. I do not want to be the king in a pleasure city. That is not my pleasure. I have spent enough time with aeronautics and those other things. I must learn how people live now, how the common life has developed. Then I shall understand these things better. I must learn how common people live, the labor people more especially, how they work, marry, bear children, die. You get that from our realistic novelist, suggested Ostrog, suddenly preoccupied. I want reality, said Graham. There are difficulties, said Ostrog, and thought. On the whole, I did not expect. I had thought, and yet perhaps you say you want to go through the ways of the city and see the common people. Suddenly he came to some conclusion. You would need to go disguised, he said. The city is intensely excited, and the discovery of your presence among them might create a fearful tumult. Still, this wish of yours to go into this city, this idea of yours, yes, now I think the thing over, it seems to me not altogether. It can be contrived. If you would really find an interest in that. You are, of course, master. You can go soon, if you like. A disguised Asano will be able to manage. He would go with you. After all, it is not a bad idea of yours. You will not want to consult me in any matter? Asked Graham suddenly, struck by an odd suspicion. Oh, dear, no. I think you may trust affairs to me for a time, at any rate, said Ostrog, smiling, even if we differ. Graham glanced at him sharply. There is no fighting likely to happen soon? He asked abruptly. Certainly not. I have been thinking about these Negroes. I don't believe the people intend any hostility to me, and after all, I am the master. I do not want any Negroes brought to London. It is an archaic prejudice, perhaps, but I have peculiar feelings about Europeans and the subject races, even about Paris. Ostrog stood watching him from under his drooping brows. I am not bringing Negroes to London, he said slowly, but if... You are not to bring armed Negroes to London, whatever happens, said Graham. In that matter, I am quite decided. Ostrog resolved not to speak and bowed deferentially. Chapter 20. In the City Ways. And that night, unknown and unsuspected, Graham dressed in the costume of an inferior wind vane official keeping holiday, and accompanied by Asano and Labor Department canvas, surveyed the city through which he had wandered when it was veiled in darkness. But now he saw it lit and waking, a whirlpool of life. In spite of the surging and swaying of the forces of revolution, in spite of the unusual discontent, the mutterings of the greater struggle of which the first revolt was but the prelude, the myriad streams of commerce still flowed wide and strong. He knew now something of the dimensions and quality of the new age, but he was not prepared for the infinite surprise of the detailed view, for the torrent of color and vivid impressions that poured past him. This was his first real contact with the people of these latter days. He realized that all that had gone before, saving his glimpses of the public theaters and markets, had had its element of seclusion, had been a movement within the comparatively narrow political quarter, that all his previous experiences had revolved immediately about the question of his own position. But here was the city at the busiest hours of night. The people, to a large extent, returned to their own immediate interests. The resumption of the real informal life, the common habits of the new time. They emerged at first into a street whose opposite ways were crowded with the blue canvas liveries. This swarm Graham saw was a portion of a procession. It was odd to see a procession parading the city seated. They carried banners of coarse black stuff with red letters. No disarmament, said the banners, for the most part in crudely daubed letters and with variant spelling. And why should we disarm? No disarming, no disarming. Banner after banner went by, a stream of banners flowing past, and at last at the end, the song of the revolt and a noisy band of strange instruments. They all ought to be at work, said Asano. They have had no food these past 2 days, or they have stolen it. Presently Asano made a detour to avoid the congested crowd that gaped upon the occasional passage of dead bodies from hospital to a mortuary, the gleanings after death's harvest of the first revolt. That night few people were sleeping, everyone was abroad. A vast excitement, perpetual crowds perpetually changing, surrounded Graham. His mind was confused and darkened by an incessant tumult, by the cries and enigmatical fragments of the social struggle that was as yet only beginning. Everywhere, festoons and banners of black and strange decorations intensified the quality of his popularity. Everywhere, he caught snatches of that crude, thick dialect that served the illiterate class, the class that is beyond the reach of phonograph culture in their commonplace intercourse. Everywhere, this trouble of disarmament was in the air, with a quality of immediate stress of which he had no inkling during his seclusion in the wind vane quarter. He perceived that as soon as he returned he must discuss this with Ostrog, this and the greater issues of which it was the expression, in a far more conclusive way than he had so far done. Perpetually that night, even in the earlier hours of their wanderings about the city, the spirit of unrest and revolt swamped his attention, to the exclusion of countless strange things he might otherwise have observed. This preoccupation made his impressions fragmentary, yet amidst so much that was strange and vivid, no subject, however personal and insistent, could exert undivided sway. There were spaces when the revolutionary movement passed clean out of his mind, was drawn aside like a curtain from before some startling new aspect of the time. Helen had swayed his mind to this intense earnestness of inquiry, but there came times when she, even, receded beyond his conscious thoughts. At one moment, for example, he found they were traversing the religious quarter, for the easy transit about the city afforded by the moving ways rendered sporadic churches and chapels no longer necessary, and his attention was vividly arrested by the facade of one of the Christian sects. They were traveling seated on one of the swift upper ways. The place leaped upon them at a bend and advanced rapidly towards them. It was covered with inscriptions from top to base, in vivid white and blue, save where a vast and glaring kinematograph transparency represented a realistic New Testament scene, and where a vast festoon of black to show that the popular religion followed the popular politics hung across the lettering. Graham had already become familiar with the phonotype writing, and these inscriptions arrested him, being, to his sense, for the most part, almost incredible blasphemy. Among the less offensive were salvation on the first floor and turn to the right, put your money on your maker, the sharpest conversation in London, expert operators, look slippy. What Christ would say to the sleeper, join the up-to-date saints. Be a Christian without hindrance to your present occupation. All the brightest bishops on the bench tonight and prices as usual. Brisk blessings for busy businessmen. But this is appalling, said Graham, as that deafening scream of mercantile piety towered above them. What is appalling? Asked his little officer, apparently seeking vainly for anything unusual in this shrieking enamel. This, surely the essence of religion is reverence. Oh, that, Asano looked at Graham. Does it shock you? He said in the tone of one who makes a discovery. I suppose it would, of course. I had forgotten. Nowadays the competition for attention is so keen, and people simply haven't the leisure to attend to their souls, as they used to do. He smiled. In the old days, you had quiet Sabbaths in the countryside, though somewhere I've read of Sunday afternoons that... But that, said Graham, glancing back at the receding blue and white, that is surely not the only. There are hundreds of different ways, but of course, if a sect doesn't tell, it doesn't pay. Worship has moved with the times. There are high-class sects with quieter ways, costly incense and personal attentions and all that. These people are extremely popular and prosperous. They pay several dozens lions for those apartments to the council. To you, I should say. Graham still felt a difficulty with the coinage, and this mention of a dozen lions brought him abruptly to that matter. In a moment, the screaming temples and their swarming touts were forgotten in this new interest. A turn of a phrase suggested, and an answer confirmed the idea that gold and silver were both demonetized, that sampled gold, which had begun its reign amidst the merchants of Phoenicia, was at last dethroned. The change had been graduated but swift, brought about by an extension of the system of checks that had even in this previous life already practically superseded gold in all the larger business transactions. The common traffic of the city, the common currency indeed of all the world, was conducted by means of the little brown, green, and pink council checks for small amounts, printed with a blank payee. Asano had several with him, and the first opportunity he supplied the gaps in his set. They were printed not on terrible paper, but on a semi-transparent fabric of silken flexibility, interwoven with silk. Across them all sprawled a facsimile of Graham's signature, his first encounter with the curves and turns of that familiar autograph for 203 years. Some intermediary experiences made no impression sufficiently vivid to prevent the matter of the disarmament claiming his thoughts again. A blurred picture of a Theosophist temple that promised miracles in enormous letters of unsteady fire was least submerged, perhaps, but then came the view of the dining hall in Northumberland Avenue. That interested him very greatly. By the energy and thought of Asano, he was able to view this place from a little screened gallery reserved for the attendants of the tables. The building was pervaded by a distant muffled hooting, piping, and bawling, of which he did not at first understand the import, but which recalled a certain mysterious leathery voice he had heard after the resumption of the lights on the night of his solitary wandering. He had grown accustomed to vastness and great numbers of people. Nevertheless, this spectacle held him for a long time. It was as he watched the table service more immediately beneath and interspersed with many questions and answers concerning details that the realization of the full significance of the feast of several thousand people came to him. It was his constant surprise to find that points that one might have expected to strike vividly at the very outset never occurred to him until some trivial detail suddenly shaped as a riddle and pointed to the obvious thing that he had overlooked. He discovered only now that this continuity of the city, this exclusion of weather, these vast halls and ways, involved the disappearance of the household, that the typical Victorian home, the little brick cell containing kitchen and scullery, living rooms and bedrooms had, save for the ruins that diversified the countryside, vanished as surely as the wattle hut. But now he saw what had indeed been manifest from the first, that London, regarded as a living place, was no longer an aggregation of houses, but of prodigious hotel, a hotel with 1,000 classes of accommodation, thousands of dining halls, chapels, theaters, markets, and places of assembly, a synthesis of enterprises, of which he chiefly was the owner. People had their sleeping rooms with, it might be, antechambers, rooms that were always sanitary at least, whatever the degree of comfort and privacy, and for the rest, they lived much as many people had lived in the new-made giant hotels of the Victorian days, eating, reading, thinking, playing, conversing, all in places of public resort, going to their work in the industrial quarters of the city or doing business in their offices in the trading section. He perceived at once how necessarily this state of affairs had developed from the Victorian city. The fundamental reason for the modern city had ever been the economy of cooperation. The chief thing to prevent the merging of the separate households in his own generation was simply the still imperfect civilization of the people, the strong barbaric pride, passions, and prejudices, the jealousies, rivalries, and violence of the middle and lower classes, which had necessitated the entire separation of contiguous households. But the taming of the people had been in rapid progress even then. In his brief 30 years of previous life, he had seen an enormous extension of the habit of consuming meals from home. The casually patronized horsebox coffee house had given place to the open and crowded aerated bread shop, for instance. Women's clubs had had their beginning, and an immense development of reading rooms, lounges, and libraries had witnessed to the growth of social confidence. These promises by this time attained to their complete fulfillment. The locked and bared household had passed away. These people below him belonged, he learnt, to the lower middle class, the class just above the blue laborers, a class so accustomed in the Victorian period to feed with every precaution of privacy that its members, when occasion confronted them with a public meal, would occasionally hide their embarrassment under horseplay or a markedly militant demeanor. But these gaily, if lightly dressed people below, albeit vivacious, hurried, and uncommunicative, were dexterously mannered and certainly quite at their ease with regard to one another. He noted a slight, significant thing. The table, as far as he could see, was and remained delightfully neat. There was nothing to parallel the confusion, the broadcast crumbs, the splashes of viand and condiment, the overturned drink and displaced ornaments, which would have marked the stormy progress of the Victorian meal. The table furniture was very different. There were no ornaments, no flowers, and the table was without a cloth, being made, he learnt, of a solid substance having the texture and appearance of damask. He discerned that this damask substance was patterned with gracefully designed trade advertisements. In a sort of recess before each dinner was a complex apparatus of porcelain and metal. There was one plate of white porcelain, and by means of taps for hot and cold volatile fluids, the diner washed himself between the courses. He also washed his elegant white metal knife and fork and spoon as occasion required. Soup and the chemical wine that was the common drink were delivered by similar taps, and the remaining covers traveled automatically in tastefully arranged dishes down the table along silver rails. The diner stopped these and helped himself at his discretion. They appeared at a little door at one end of the table and vanished at the other. That turn of democratic sentiment in decay, that ugly pride of menial souls, which renders equals loth to wait on one another, was very strong, he found, among these people. He was so preoccupied with these details that it was only as he was leaving the place that he remarked the huge advertisement dioramas that marched majestically along the upper walls and proclaimed the most remarkable commodities. Beyond this place they came into a crowded hall, and he discovered the cause of the noise that had perplexed him. They paused at a turnstile at which a payment was made. Graham's attention was immediately arrested by a violent, loud hoot, followed by a vast, leathery voice. "The master is sleeping peacefully," it vociferated. "He is in excellent health. He is going to devote the rest of his life to aeronautics. He says women are more beautiful than ever. Galloop! Wow! Our wonderful civilization astonishes him beyond measure. Beyond all measure. Galloop! He puts great trust in Boss Ostrog, absolute confidence in Boss Ostrog. Ostrog is to be his chief minister, is authorized to remove or reinstate public officers. All patronage will be in his hands, all patronage in the hands of Boss Ostrog. The counselors have been sent back to their own prison above the council house." Graham stopped at the first sentence and, looking up, beheld a foolish trumpet face from which this was brayed. This was the General Intelligence Machine. For a space it seemed to be gathering breath, and a regular throbbing from its cylindrical body was audible. Then it trumpeted, "Galloop, galloop," and broke out again. "Paris is now pacified. All resistance is over. Galloop, the black police hold every position of importance in the city. They fought with great bravery, singing songs written in praise of their ancestors by the poet Kipling. Once or twice they got out of hand and tortured and mutilated wounded and captured insurgents, men and women. Moral, don't go rebelling. Ha ha, galloop, galloop. They are lively fellows, lively brave fellows. Let this be a lesson to the disorderly banderlog of this city. Ya, banderlog, filth of the earth, galloop, galloop." The voice ceased. There was a confused murmur of disapproval among the crowd. "Damned niggers." A man began to harangue near them. "Is this the master's doing, brothers? Is this the master's doing?" "Black police," said Graham. "What is that? You don't mean—" Asano touched his arm and gave him a warning look, and forthwith another of these mechanisms screamed deafeningly and gave tongue in a shrill voice. "Ya-ha-ha! Ya-ha-ha! Yap! Hear a live paper yelp! Live paper! Ya-ha! Shocking outrage in Paris! Ya-ha-ha! The Parisians exasperated by the black police to the pitch of assassination. Dreadful reprisals. Savage times come again. Blood, blood, yaha." The nearer babble machine hooted stupendously, "Galloop, galloop," drowned the end of the sentence, and proceeded in a rather flatter note than before with novel comments on the horrors of disorder. "Law and order must be maintained," said the nearer babble machine. "But," began Graham. "Don't ask questions here," said Asano, "or you will be involved in an argument." "Then let us go on," said Graham, "for I want to know more of this." As he and his companion pushed their way through the excited crowd that swarmed beneath these voices towards the exit, Graham conceived more clearly the proportion and features of this room. Altogether, great and small, there must have been nearly 1,000 of these erections, piping, hooting, bawling, and gabbling in that great space, each with its crowd of excited listeners, the majority of them men, dressed in blue canvas. There were all sizes of machines, from the little gossiping mechanisms that chuckled out mechanical sarcasm in odd corners, through a number of grades to such 50-foot giants as that which had first hooted over Graham. This place was unusually crowded because of the intense public interest in the course of affairs in Paris. Evidently, the struggle had been much more savage than Ostrog had represented it. All the mechanisms were discoursing upon that topic, and the repetition of the people made the huge hive buzz with such phrases as lynched policemen, women burnt alive, fuzzy wuzzy. But does the master allow such things? Asked a man near him. Is this the beginning of the master's rule? Is this the beginning of the master's rule? For a long time after he had left the place, the hooting, whistling, and braying of the machines pursued him. Galoop, galoop, yaha-ha, yaha, yap, yaha. Is this the beginning of the master's rule? Directly they were out upon the ways, he began to question Asano closely on the nature of the Parisian struggle. This disarmament, what was their trouble? What does it all mean? Asano seemed chiefly anxious to reassure him that it was all right. But these outrages. You cannot have an omelet, said Asano, without breaking eggs. It is only the rough people, only in one part of the city. All the rest is all right. The Parisian laborers are the wildest in the world, except ours. What, the Londoners? No, the Japanese, they have to be kept in order. But burning women alive. A commune, said Asano. They would rob you of your property. They would do away with property and give the world over to mob rule. You are master, the world is yours, but there will be no commune here. There is no need for black police here. And every consideration has been shown. It is their own Negroes, French-speaking Negroes, Senegal regiments, and Niger and Timbuktu. Regiments? Said Graham. I thought there was only one. No, said Asano, and glanced at him. There is more than one. Graham felt unpleasantly helpless. I did not think, he began, and stopped abruptly. He went off at a tangent to ask for information about these babble machines. For the most part, the crowd present had been shabbily or even raggedly dressed, and Graham learnt that so far as the more prosperous classes were concerned, in all the more comfortable private apartments of the city were fixed with babble machines that would speak directly. A lever was pulled. The tenant of the apartment could connect this with the cables of any of the great news syndicates that he preferred. When he learnt this presently, he demanded the reason of their absence from his own suite of apartments. Asano was embarrassed. I never thought, he said. Ostrog must have had them removed. Graham stared. How was I to know? He exclaimed. Perhaps he thought they would annoy you, said Asano. They must be replaced directly I return, said Graham after an interval. He found a difficulty in understanding that this newsroom and the dining hall were not great central places, that such establishments were repeated almost beyond counting all over the city. But ever and again during the night's expedition his ears would pick out from the tumult of the ways the peculiar hooting of the organ of Boss Ostrog, Galoop, Galoop, or the shrill Yaha-ha, Yaha, Yap. Hear a live paper yelp of its chief rival. Repeated, too, everywhere were such crashes as the one he now entered. He was reached by a lift and by a glass bridge that flung across the dining hall and traversed the ways at a slight upward angle. To enter the first section of the place necessitated the use of his solvent signature under Asano's direction. They were immediately attended to by a man in a violet robe and gold clasp, the insignia of practicing medical men. He perceived from this man's manner that his identity was known, and proceeded to ask questions on the strange arrangements of the place without reserve. On either side of the passage, which was silent and padded, as if to deaden the footfall, were narrow little doors, their size and arrangements suggestive of the cells of a Victorian prison, but the upper portion of each door was of the same greenish transparent stuff that had enclosed him at his awakening, and within, dimly seen, lay in every case a very young baby in the little nest of wadding. Elaborate apparatus watched the atmosphere and rang a bell far away in the central office at the slightest departure from the optimum of temperature and moisture. A system of such creches had almost entirely replaced the hazardous adventures of the old world nursing. The attendant presently called Graham's attention to the wet nurses, a vista of mechanical figures with arms, shoulders, and breasts of astonishingly realistic modeling, articulation, and texture, but mere brass tripods below, and having in the place of features a flat disc bearing advertisements likely to be of interest to mothers. Of all the strange things that Graham came upon that night, none jarred more upon his habits of thought than this place. The spectacle of the little pink creatures, their feeble limbs swaying uncertainly in vague first movements, left alone, without embrace or endearment, was wholly repugnant to him. The attendant doctor was of a different opinion. His statistical evidence showed beyond dispute that in the Victorian times the most dangerous passage of life was the arms of the mother, that their human mortality had ever been most terrible. On the other hand, this creche company, the International Creche Syndicate, lost not 0.5% of the million babies or so that formed its peculiar care. But Graham's prejudice was too strong even for those figures. Along one of the many passages of the place they presently came upon a young couple in the usual blue canvas, peering through the transparency and laughing hysterically at the bald head of their firstborn. Graham's face must have showed his estimate of them, for their merriment ceased and they looked abashed. But this little incident accentuated his sudden realization of the gulf between his habits of thought and the ways of the new age. He passed on to the crawling rooms in the kindergarten, perplexed and distressed. He found the endless long playrooms were empty. The latter-day children at least still spent their nights in sleep. As they went through these, the little officer pointed out the nature of the toys, developments of those devised by that inspired sentimentalist Frugal. There were nurses here, but much was done by machines that sang and danced and dandled. Graham was still not clear upon many points, but so many orphans, he said perplexed, reverting to the first misconception, and learnt again that they were not orphans. So soon as they had left the creche, he began to speak of the horror the babies in their incubating cases had caused him. "Is motherhood gone?" he said. "Was it a cant? Surely it was an instinct. This seems so unnatural, abominable almost." "Along here we shall come to the dancing place," said Asano by way of reply. "It is sure to be crowded. In spite of all the political unrest, it will be crowded. The women take no great interest in politics, except a few here and there. You will see the mothers. Most young women in London are mothers. In that case, it is considered a creditable thing to have one child, a proof of animation. Few middle-class people have more than one. With the Labor Department, it is different. As for motherhood, they still take an immense pride in the children. They come here to look at them quite often." "Then do you mean that the population of the world is falling?" "Yes, except among the people under the Labor Department. In spite of scientific discipline, they are reckless." The air was suddenly dancing with music, and down a way they approached obliquely, set with gorgeous pillars as it seemed a clear amethyst. Flowed a concourse of gay people and a tumult of merry cries and laughter. He saw curled heads, wreathed brows, and a happy, intricate flutter of gamboge pass triumphant across the picture. "You will see," said Asano with a faint smile, "the world has changed. In a moment you will see the mothers of the new age. Come this way. We shall see those yonder again very soon." They ascended a certain height in a swift lift and changed to a slower one. As they went on, the music grew upon them, until it was near and full and splendid, and moving with its glorious intricacies, they could distinguish the beat of innumerable dancing feet. They made a payment at a turnstile and emerged upon the wide gallery that overlooked the dancing place and upon the full enchantment of sound and sight. "Here," said Asano, "are the fathers and mothers of the little ones you saw." The hall was not so richly decorated as that of the Atlas, but saving that it was, for its size, the most splendid Graham had seen. The beautiful white-limbed figures that supported the galleries reminded him once more of the restored magnificence of sculpture. They seemed to writhe in engaging attitudes, their faces laughed. The source of the music that filled the place was hidden, and the whole vast shining floor was thick with dancing couples. "Look at them," said the little officer. "See how much they show of motherhood." The gallery they stood upon ran along the upper edge of a huge screen that cut the dancing hall on one side from a sort of outer hall that showed through broad arches the incessant onward rush of the city ways. In this outer hall was a great crowd of less brilliantly dressed people, as numerous almost as those who danced within, the great majority wearing the blue uniform of the Labor Department that was now so familiar to Graham. Too poor to pass the turnstiles to the festival, they were yet unable to keep away from the sound of its seductions. Some of them even had cleared spaces, and were dancing also, fluttering their rags in the air. Some shouted as they danced, jests and odd allusions Graham did not understand. Once someone began whistling the refrain of the revolutionary song, but it seemed as though that beginning was promptly suppressed. The corner was dark and Graham could not see. He turned to the hall again. Above the caryatids were marble busts of men whom that age esteemed great moral emancipators and pioneers. For the most part, their names were strange to Graham, though he recognized Grant Allen, Le Gallienne, Nietzsche, Shelley, and Goodwin. Great black festoons and eloquent sentiments reinforced the huge inscription that partially defaced the upper end of the dancing place and asserted that the festival of the awakening was in progress. Myriads are taking holiday or staying from work because of that, quite apart from the laborers who refuse to go back, said Asano. These people are always ready for holidays. Graham walked to the parapet and stood leaning over, looking down at the dancers. Save for 2 or 3 remote whispering couples who had stolen apart, he and his guide had the gallery to themselves. A warm breath of scent and vitality came up to him. Both men and women below were lightly clad, bare-armed, open-necked, as the universal warmth of the city permitted. The hair of the men was often a mass of effeminate curls. Their chins were always shaven, and many of them had flushed or colored cheeks. Many of the women were very pretty, and all were dressed with elaborate coquetry. As they swept by beneath, he saw ecstatic faces with eyes half closed in pleasure. "What sort of people are these?" he asked abruptly. "Workers, prosperous workers. What you would have called the middle class, independent tradesmen with little separate businesses have vanished long ago. But there are store servers, managers, engineers of hundred sorts. Tonight is a holiday, of course, and every dancing place in the city will be crowded, and every place of worship. But the women? The same. There's 1,000 forms of work for women now, but you had the beginning of the independent working woman in your days. Most women are independent now. Most of these are married, more or less. There are a number of methods of contract, and that gives them more money and enables them to enjoy themselves." "I see," said Graham, looking at the flushed faces, the flash and swirl of movement, and still thinking of that nightmare of pink, helpless limbs. "And these are mothers?" "Most of them. The more I see of these things, the more complex I find your problems. This, for instance, is a surprise. That news from Paris was a surprise." In a little while he spoke again. "These are mothers. Presently, I suppose, I shall get into the modern way of seeing things. I have old habits of mine clinging about me. Habits based, I suppose, on needs that are over and done with. Of course, in our time, a woman was supposed not only to bear children, but to cherish them, to devote herself to them, to educate them. All the essentials of moral and mental education a child owed its mother. Or went without. Quite a number, I admit, went without. Nowadays, clearly, there is no more need for such care than if they were butterflies. I see that. Only there was an ideal, that figure of a grave, patient woman, silently and serenely mistress of a home, mother and maker of men. To love her was a sort of worship." He stopped and repeated, "A sort of worship." "Ideals change," said the little man, "as needs change." Graham awoke from an instant reverie, and Asano repeated his words. Graham's mind returned to the thing at hand. "Of course, I see the perfect reasonableness of this. Restraint, soberness, the matured thought, the unselfish act. They are necessities of the barbarous state, the life of danger. Dourness is a man's tribute to unconquered nature. But man has conquered nature now for all practical purposes. His political affairs are managed by bosses with a black police, and life is joyous." He looked at the dancers again. "Joyous," he said. "There are weary moments," said the little officer, reflectively. "They all look young. Down there I should be visibly the oldest man. And in my time I should have passed as middle-aged. They are young. There are few old people in this class in the work cities. How is that? Old people's lives are not so pleasant as they used to be, unless they are rich to hire lovers and helpers, as we have an institution called euthanasia." "Ah, that euthanasia," said Graham. "The easy death?" "The easy death is the last pleasure. The euthanasia company does it well. People will pay the sum. It is a costly thing. Long beforehand, go off to some pleasure city and return impoverished and weary and very weary." "There's a lot left for me to understand," said Graham after a pause. "Yet I see the logic of it all. Our array of angry virtues and sour restraints was the consequence of danger and insecurity. The Stoic, the Puritan, even in my time, were vanishing types. In the old days, man was armed against pain. Now he is eager for pleasure. There lies the difference. Civilization has driven pain and danger so far off for well-to-do people. And only well-to-do people matter now. I have been asleep 200 years. For a minute they leant on the balustrading, following the intricate evolution of the dance. Indeed, the scene was very beautiful. "Before God," said Graham suddenly, "I would rather be a wounded sentinel freezing in the snow than one of these painted fools." "In the snow," said Asano, "one might think differently." I am uncivilized, said Graham, not heeding him. That is the trouble. I am primitive, Paleolithic. Their fountain of rage and fear and anger is sealed and closed. The habits of a lifetime make them cheerful and easy and delightful. You must bear with my 19th century shocks and disgusts. These people, you say, are skilled workers and so forth. And while these dance, men are fighting, men are dying in Paris to keep the world, that they may dance. Asano smiled faintly. For that matter, men are dying in London, he said. There was a moment's silence. Where do these sleep? Asked Graham. Above and below, an intricate warren. And where do they work? This is the domestic life. You will see little work tonight. Half the workers are out or under arms. Half these people are keeping holiday. But we will go to the workplaces if you wish. For a time, Graham watched the dancers, then suddenly turned away. I want to see the workers. I've seen enough of these, he said. Asano led the way along the gallery across the dancing hall. Presently, they came to a transverse passage that brought a breath of fresher, colder air. Asano glanced at this passage as they went past, stopped, went back to it, and turned to Graham with a smile. Here, sire, he said, is something. Will be familiar to you at least, and yet, but I will not tell you. Come. He led the way along a closed passage that presently became cold. The reverberation of their feet told that this passage was a bridge. They came to a circular gallery that was glazed in from the outer weather, and so reached a circular chamber which seemed familiar, though Graham could not recall distinctly when he had entered it before. In this was a ladder, the first ladder he had seen since his awakening, up which they went and came into a high, dark, cold place in which was another almost vertical ladder. This they ascended, Graham still perplexed, but at the top he understood and recognized the metallic bars to which he clung. He was in the cage under the ball of St. Paul's. The dome rose but a little way above the general contour of the city into the still twilight and sloped away, shining greasily under a few distant lights into a circumambient ditch of darkness. Out between the bars, he looked upon the wind-clear northern sky and saw the starry constellations all unchanged. Capella hung in the west, Vega was rising, and the 7 glittering points of the Great Bear swept overhead in their stately circle about the pole. He saw these stars in a clear gap of sky. To the east and south, the great circular shapes of complaining wind wheels blotted out the heavens, so that the glare about the council house was hidden. To the southwest hung Orion, showing like a pallid ghost through a tracery of ironwork and interlacing shapes above a dazzling coruscation of lights. A bellowing and siren screaming that came from the flying stages warned the world that one of the aeroplanes was ready to start. He remained for a space gazing towards the glaring stage, then his eyes went back to the northward constellations. For a long time he was silent. This, he said at last, smiling in the shadow, seems the strangest thing of all. To stand in the dome of St. Paul's and look once more upon these familiar silent stars. Thence Graham was taken by Asano along devious ways to the great gambling and business quarters, where the bulk of the fortunes in the city were lost and made. It impressed him as a well-nigh interminable series of very high walls, surrounded by tiers upon tiers of galleries, into which opened thousands of offices, and traversed by a complicated multitude of bridges, footways, aerial motor rails, and trapeze and cable leaps. And here more than anywhere the note of vehement vitality, of uncontrollable hasty activity rose high. Everywhere was violent advertisement until his brain swam at the tumult of light and color, and babble machines of a peculiarly rancid tone were abundant and filled the air with strenuous squealing and an idiotic slang. Skin your eyes and slide, gewhoop, bonanza, gollopers, come and hark. The place seemed to him to be dense with people either profoundly agitated or swelling with obscure cunning. Yet he learnt that the place was comparatively empty, that the great political convulsion of the last few days had reduced transactions to an unprecedented minimum. In one huge place were long avenues of roulette tables, each with an excited, undignified crowd about it. In another, a yelping babble of white-faced women and red-necked, leathery-lunged men bought and sold the shares of an absolutely fictitious business undertaking which, every 5 minutes, paid a dividend of 10% and cancelled a certain proportion of its shares by means of a lottery wheel. These business activities were prosecuted with an energy that readily passed into violence, and Graham, approaching a dense crowd, found at its center a couple of prominent merchants in violent controversy, with teeth and nails on some delicate point of business etiquette. Something still remained in life to be fought for. Further, he had a shock at a vehement announcement in phonetic letters of scarlet flame, each twice the height of a man, that, "We assure the proprietor, we assure the proprietor." "Who's the proprietor?" he asked. "You." "But what did they assure me?" he asked. "What did they assure me?" "Didn't you have assurance?" Graham thought. Insurance? Yes, insurance. I remember, that was the older word. They are insuring your life. Dozens of people are taking out policies. Myriads of lines are being put on you. And further on, other people are buying annuities. They do that on everybody who is at all prominent. Look there. A crowd of eager people surged and roared, and Graham saw a vast black screen suddenly illuminated in still larger letters of burning purple, annuitas on the proprietor, ×5 PRG. The people began to boo and shout at this, a number of hard-breathing, wild-eyed men came running past, clawing with hooked fingers in the air. There was a furious crush about a little doorway. Asano did a brief, inaccurate calculation. 17% per annum is their annuity on you. They would not pay so much percent if they could see you now, sire, but they do not know. Your own annuities used to be a very safe investment, but now you are sheer gambling, of course. This is probably a desperate bid. I doubt if people will get their money. The crowd of would-be annuitants grew so thick about them that for some time they could move neither forward nor backward. Graham noticed what appeared to him to be a high proportion of women among the speculators, and was reminded again of the economic independence of their sex. They seemed remarkably well able to take care of themselves in the crowd, using their elbows with particular skill as he learnt to his cost. One curly-headed person, caught in the pressure for a space, looked steadfastly at him several times, almost as if she recognized him, and then, edging deliberately towards him, touched his hand with her arm in a scarcely accidental manner, and made it plain by a look as ancient as Chaldea that he had found favor in her eyes. And then a lank, gray-bearded man, perspiring copiously in a noble passion of self-help, blind to all earthly things save that glaring bait, thrust between them in a cataclysmal rush towards that alluring X5% G. "I want to get out of this," said Graham to Asano. "This is not what I came to see. Show me the workers. I want to see the people in blue. These parasitic lunatics." He found himself wedged into a straggling mass of people. Chapter 21. The Underside. From the business quarter, they presently passed by the running ways into a remote quarter of the city, where the bulk of the manufactures was done. On their way, the platforms crossed the Thames twice, and passed in a broad viaduct across one of the great roads that entered the city from the north. In both cases, his impression was swift, and in both very vivid. The river was a broad, wrinkled glitter of black seawater, overarched by buildings, and vanishing either way into a blackness starred with receding lights. A string of black barges passed seaward. Manned by blue-clad men, the road was a long and very broad and high tunnel, along which big-wheeled machines drove noiselessly and swiftly. Here, too, the distinctive blue of the Labor Department was in abundance. The smoothness of the double tracks, the largeness and the lightness of the big pneumatic wheels in proportion to the vehicular body, struck Graham most vividly. One lank and very high carriage with longitudinal metallic rods, hung with the dripping carcasses of many hundred sheep, arrested his attention unduly. Abruptly, the edge of the archway cut and blotted out the picture. Presently, they left the way and descended by a lift and traversed a passage that sloped downward, and so came to a descending lift again. The appearance of things changed. Even the pretense of architectural ornament disappeared. The lights diminished in number and size. The architecture became more and more massive in proportion to the spaces as the factory quarters were reached. And in the dusty biscuit-making place of the potters, among the felspar mills, in the furnace rooms of the metal workers, among the incandescent lakes of crude Edomite, the blue canvas clothing was on man, woman, and child. Many of these great and dusty galleries were silent avenues of machinery. Endless raked out ashen furnaces testified for the revolutionary dislocation. But wherever there was work, it was being done by slow-moving workers in blue canvas. The only people not in blue canvas were the overlookers of the workplaces and the orange-clad labor police. And fresh from the flushed faces of the dancing halls, the voluntary vigors of the business quarter, Graham could note the pinched faces, the feeble muscles, and weary eyes of many of the latter-day workers. Such as he saw at work were noticeably inferior in physique to the few gaily dressed managers and forewomen who were directing their labors. The burly laborers of the old Victorian times had followed that dray horse and all such living force producers to extinction. The place of his costly muscles was taken by some dexterous machine. The latter-day laborer, male as well as female, was essentially a machine minder and feeder, a servant and attendant, or an artist under direction. The women, in comparison with those Graham remembered, were as a class distinctly plain and flat-chested. 200 years of emancipation from the moral restraints of puritanical religion, 200 years of city life had done their work in eliminating the strain of feminine beauty and vigor from the blue canvas myriads. To be brilliant physically or mentally, to be in any way attractive or exceptional, had been and was still a certain way of emancipation to the drudge, a line of escape to the pleasure city and its splendors and delights, and at last to the euthanasia and peace. To be steadfast against such inducements was scarcely to be expected of meanly nourished souls. In the young cities of Graham's former life, the newly aggregated laboring mass had been a diverse multitude, still stirred by the tradition of personal honor and a high morality. Now it was differentiating into an extinct class, with a moral and physical difference of its own, even with a dialect of its own. They penetrated downward, ever downward, towards the working places. Presently they passed underneath one of the streets of the moving ways, and saw its platforms running on their rails far overhead, and chinks of white lights between the transverse slits. The factories that were not working were sparsely lighted. To Graham, they and their shrouded aisles of giant machines seemed plunged in gloom, and even where work was going on, the illumination was far less brilliant than upon the public ways. Beyond the blazing lakes of Edomite, he came to the warren of the jewelers, and with some difficulty, and by using his signature, obtained admission to these galleries. They were high and dark and rather cold. In the first, a few men were making ornaments of gold filigree, each man a little bench by himself, and with a little shaded light. The long vista of light patches, with the nimble fingers brightly lit and moving among the gleaming yellow coils, and the intent face, like the man of a ghost in each shadow, had the oddest effect. The work was beautifully executed, but without any strength of modeling or drawing. For the most part, intricate grotesques or the ringing of the changes on the geometrical motif. These workers wore a peculiar white uniform without pockets or sleeves. They assumed this on coming to work, but at night they were stripped and examined before they left the premises of the department. In spite of every other precaution, the labor policeman told them in a depressed tone the department was not infrequently robbed. Beyond was a gallery of women busied in cutting and setting slabs of artificial ruby, and next these were men and women working together upon the slabs of copper net that formed the basis of cloisonné tiles. Many of these workers had lips and nostrils a livid white, due to a disease caused by a peculiar purple enamel that chanced to be much in fashion. Asano apologized to Graham for this offensive sight, but excused himself on the score of the convenience of this route. "This is what I wanted to see," said Graham. "This is what I wanted to see," trying to avoid a start at a particularly striking disfigurement. "She might have done better with herself than that," said Asano. Graham made some indignant comments. "But sire, we simply could not stand that stuff without the purple," said Asano. "In your days, people could stand with such crudities. They were nearer the barbaric by 200 years. They continued along one of the lower galleries of this cloisonné factory and came to a little bridge that spanned a vault. Looking over the parapet, Graham saw that beneath was a wharf under yet more tremendous archings than any he had seen. 3 barges, smothered in floury dust, were being unloaded of their cargoes of powdered feldspar by a multitude of coughing men, each guiding a little truck. The dust filled the place with a choking mist and turned the electric glare yellow. The vague shadows of these workers gesticulated about their feet and rushed to and fro against a long stretch of whitewashed wall. Every now and then one would stop to cough. A shadowy, huge mass of masonry rising out of the inky water brought to Graham's mind the thought of the multitude of ways and galleries and lifts that rose floor above floor overhead between him and the sky. The men worked in silence under the supervision of two of the labor police. Their feet made a hollow thunder on the planks along which they went to and fro. As he looked on at the scene, some hidden voice in the darkness began to sing. "Stop that!" shouted one of the policemen, but the order was disobeyed. And first one and then all the white-stained men who were working there had taken up the beating refrain, singing it defiantly, the song of the revolt. The feet upon the planks thundered now to the rhythm of the song, tramp, tramp, tramp. The policeman who had shouted glanced at his fellow, and Graham saw him shrug his shoulders. He made no further effort to stop the singing. And so they went through these factories and places of toil, seeing many painful and grim things. That walk left on Graham's mind a maze of memories, fluctuating pictures of swathed halls and crowded vaults seen through clouds of dust, of intricate machines, the racing threads of looms, the heavy beat of stamping machinery, the roar and battle of belt and armature, of ill-lit subterranean aisles of sleeping places, illimitable vistas of pinpoint lights. Here was the smell of tanning, and here the reek of a brewery, and here unprecedented reeks. Everywhere were pillars and cross-archings of such a massiveness as Graham had never before seen, thick titans of greasy, shining brickwork crushed beneath the vast weight of that complex city world, even as these anemic millions were crushed by its complexity. And everywhere were pale features, lean limbs, disfigurement, and degradation. Once and again a third time, Graham heard the song of the revolt during his long, unpleasant research in these places, and once he saw a confused struggle down a passage and learnt that a number of these serfs had seized their bread before their work was done. Graham was ascending towards the ways again when he saw a number of blue-clad children running down a transverse passage, and presently perceived the reason of their panic in a company of the labor police armed with clubs, trotting towards some unknown disturbance. And then came a remote disorder. But for the most part this remnant that worked hopelessly. All the spirit that was left in fallen humanity was above in the streets that night, calling for the master, and valiantly and noisily keeping its arms. They emerged from these wanderings and stood blinking in the bright light of the middle passage of the platforms again. They became aware of the remote hooting and yelping of the machines of one of the General Intelligence offices, and suddenly came men running, and along the platforms and about the ways everywhere was a shouting and crying, then a woman with a face of mute white terror, and another who gasped and shrieked as she ran. "What has happened now?" said Graham, puzzled, for he could not understand their thick speech. Then he heard it in English and perceived that the thing that everyone was shouting, that men yelled to one another, that women took up screaming, that was passing like the first breeze of a thunderstorm, chill and sudden through the city, was this: "Ostrog has ordered the black police to London. The black police are coming from South Africa. The black police, the black police." Asano's face was white and astonished. He hesitated, looked at Graham's face, and told him the thing he already knew. "But how can they know?" asked Asano. Graham heard someone shouting, "Stop all work! Stop all work!" And a swarthy hunchback, ridiculously gay in green and gold, came leaping down the platforms towards him, bawling again and again in good English, "This is Ostrog's doing. Ostrog the knave, the master is betrayed." His voice was hoarse, and a thin foam dropped from his ugly shouting mouth. He yelled in unspeakable horror that the black police had done in Paris, and so passed shrieking, "Ostrog the knave." For a moment Graham stood still, for it had come upon him again that these things were a dream. He looked up at the great cliff of buildings on either side, vanishing into blue haze at last above the lights, and down to the roaring tiers of platforms, and the shouting, running people who were gesticulating past. "The master is betrayed," they cried, "the master is betrayed." Suddenly the situation shaped itself in his mind real and urgent. His heart began to beat fast and strong. "It has come," he said. "I might have known the hour has come." He thought swiftly, "What am I to do?" "Go back to the council house," said Asano. "Why should I not appeal? The people are here." "You will lose time. They will doubt if it is you, but they will mass about the council house, and there you will find their leaders. Your strength is there with them." "Suppose this is only a rumor?" "It sounds true," said Asano. "Let us have the facts," said Graham. Asano shrugged his shoulders. "We had better get towards the council house," he cried. "That is where they will swarm. Even now the ruins may be impassable." Graham regarded him doubtfully and followed him. They went up the step platforms to the swiftest one, and there Asano accosted a laborer. The answer to his questions were in a thick, vulgar speech. "What did he say?" asked Graham. "He knows little, but he told me that the black police would have arrived here before the people knew, had not someone in the Windvane offices learnt. He said a girl." "A girl? Not—" "He said a girl, he did not say who she was, who came out from the council house crying aloud and told the men at work among the ruins. And then another thing was shouted, something that turned on aimless tumult and determinate movements. It came like a wind along the street. 'To your wards, to your wards, every man get arms, every man to his ward.'" Chapter 22. The Struggle in the Council House. As Asano and Graham hurried along to the ruins about the council house, they saw everywhere the excitement of the people rising. "To your wards, to your wards!" Everywhere, men and women in blue were hurrying from unknown subterranean employments up the staircases of the middle path. At one place, Graham saw an arsenal of the Revolutionary Committee besieged by a crowd of shouting men. At another, a couple of men in the hated yellow uniform of the labor police, pursued by a gathering crowd, fled precipitately along the swift way that went in the opposite direction. The cries of "To your wards" became at last a continuous shouting as they drew near the government quarter. Many of the shouts were unintelligible. "Ostrog has betrayed us," one man bawled in a hoarse voice again and again, dinning that refrain into Graham's ear until it haunted him. This person stayed close behind Graham and Asano on the swift way, shouting to the people who swarmed on the lower platforms as he rushed past them. His cry about Ostrog alternated with some incomprehensible orders. Presently, he went leaping down and disappeared. Graham's mind was filled with the din. His plans were vague and unformed. He had one picture of some commanding position from which he could address the multitudes, another of meeting Ostrog face to face. He was full of rage, of tense muscular excitement. His hands gripped, his lips were pressed together. The way to the council house across the ruins was impassable, but Asano met that difficulty and took Graham into the premises of the central post office. The post office was nominally at work, but the blue-clothed porters moved sluggishly or had stopped to stare through the arches of their galleries at the shouting men who were going by outside. "Every man to his ward! Every man to his ward!" Here, by Asano's advice, Graham revealed his identity. They crossed to the council house by a cradle. Already, in the brief intervals since the capitulation of the councillors, a great change had been wrought in the appearance of the ruins. The spurting cascades of the ruptured seawater mains had been captured and tamed, and huge temporary pipes ran overhead along a flimsy-looking fabric of girders. The sky was laced with restored cables and wires that served the council house, and a mass of new fabric with cranes and other building machines going to and fro upon it, projected to the left of the white pile. The moving ways that ran across this area had been restored, albeit for once running under the open sky. These were the ways that Graham had seen from the little balcony in the hour of his awakening not 9 days since, and the hall of his trance had been on the farther side, where now shapeless piles of smashed and shattered masonry were heaped together. It was already high day and the sun was shining brightly. Out of their tall caverns of blue electric light came the swift ways crowded with multitudes of people, who poured off them and gathered ever denser over the wreckage and confusion of the ruins. The air was full of their shouting, and they were pressing and swaying towards the central building. For the most part, that shouting mass consisted of shapeless swarms, but here and there, Graham could see that a rude discipline struggled to establish itself, and every voice clamored for order in the chaos. "To your wards, every man to his ward!" The cable carried them into a hall which Graham recognized as the antechamber to the Hall of the Atlas, about the gallery of which he had walked days ago with Howard to show himself to the vanished council, an hour from his awakening. Now the place was empty except for 2 cable attendants. These men seemed hugely astonished to recognize the sleeper and the man who swung down from the cross seat. "Where's Ostrog?" he demanded. "I must see Ostrog forthwith." "He has disobeyed me. I have come back to take things out of his hands." Without waiting for Asano, he went straight across the place, ascended the steps at the further end, and pulling the curtain aside, found himself facing the perpetually laboring Titan. The hall was empty. Its appearance had changed very greatly since his first sight of it. It had suffered serious injury in the violent struggle of the first outbreak. On the right-hand side of the great figure, the upper half of the wall had been torn away for nearly 200 feet of its length, and a sheet of the same glassy film that had enclosed Graham at his awakening had been drawn across the gap. This deadened, but did not altogether exclude the roar of the people outside. "Wards, wards, wards," they seemed to be saying. Through it, there were visible the beams and supports of metal scaffoldings that rose and fell according to the requirements of a great crowd of workmen, an idle building machine with lank arms of red-painted metal stretched gauntly across this green-tinted picture. On it were still a number of workmen staring at the crowd below. For a moment he stood regarding these things, and Asano overtook him. "Ostrog," said Asano, "will be in the small offices beyond there." The little man looked livid now, and his eyes searched Graham's face. They had scarcely advanced 10 paces from the curtain before a little panel to the left of Atlas rolled up, and Ostrog, accompanied by Lincoln and followed by 2 black and yellow-clad Negroes, appeared crossing the remote corner of the hall towards a second panel that was raised and open. "Ostrog!" shouted Graham, and at the sound of his voice the little party turned astonished. Ostrog said something to Lincoln and advanced alone. Graham was the first to speak. His voice was loud and dictatorial. "What is this I hear?" he asked. "Are you bringing Negroes here to keep people down?" "It is none too soon," said Ostrog. "They've been getting out of hand more and more since the revolt. I underestimated. Do you mean that these infernal Negroes are on the way?" "On the way, as it is. You have seen the people outside?" "No wonder, but after what was said, you have taken too much on yourself, Ostrog." Ostrog said nothing, but drew nearer. "These Negroes must not come to London," said Graham. "I am master, and they shall not come." Ostrog glanced at Lincoln, who at once came towards them with his 2 attendants close behind him. "Why not?" asked Ostrog. "White men must be mastered by white men. Besides, the Negroes are only an instrument. But that is not the question. I am the master. I mean to be the master. And I tell you, these Negroes shall not come." "The people. I believe in the people. Because you are an anachronism. You are a man out of the past, an accident. You are owner, perhaps, of the world, nominally, legally, but you are not master. You do not know enough to be master." He glanced at Lincoln again. "I know now what you think. I can guess something of what you mean to do. Even now, it is not too late to warn you. You dream of human equality, of some sort of socialistic order. You have all those worn-out dreams of the 19th century fresh and vivid in your mind, and you would rule this age that you do not understand." "Listen," said Graham. "You can hear it, a sound like the sea, not voices, but a voice. Do you altogether understand?" "We taught them that," said Ostrog. "Perhaps. Can you teach them to forget it? But enough of this. These Negroes must not come." There was a pause, and Ostrog looked him in the eyes. "They will," he said. "I forbid it," said Graham. "They have started." "I will not have it." "No," said Ostrog. "Sorry as I am to follow the method of the council. For your own good, you must not side with disorder. And now that you are here, it was kind of you to come here." Lincoln laid his hand on Graham's shoulder. Abruptly, Graham realized the enormity of his blunder in coming to the council house. He turned towards the curtains that separated the hall from the antechamber. The clutching hand of Asano intervened. In another moment, Lincoln had grasped Graham's cloak. He turned and struck at Lincoln's face, and incontinently a Negro had him by collar and arm. He wrenched himself away, his sleeve tore noiselessly, and he stumbled back to be tripped by the other attendant. Then he struck the ground heavily, and he was staring at the distant ceiling of the hall. He shouted, rolled over, struggling fiercely, clutched an attendant's leg and threw him headlong and struggled to his feet. Lincoln appeared before him, went down heavily again with a blow under the point of the jaw and lay still. Graham made 2 strides, stumbled, and when Ostrog's arm was round his neck, he was pulled over backwards, fell heavily, and his arms were pinned to the ground. After a few violent efforts, he ceased to struggle and lay staring at Ostrog's heaving throat. "You are a prisoner," panted Ostrog, exulting. "You were rather a fool to come back." Graham turned his head about and perceived that the irregular green window in the walls of the hall of the men who had been working on the building cranes gesticulating excitedly to the people below him. They had seen. Ostrog followed his eyes and started. He shouted something to Lincoln, but Lincoln did not move. A bullet smashed among the moldings above Atlas. The 2 sheets of transparent matter that had been stretched across this gap were rent. The edges of the torn aperture darkened, curved, ran rapidly towards the framework, and in a moment the council chamber stood open to the air. A chilly gust blew in by the gap, bringing with it a war of voices from the ruinous space without. An elvish babblement. Save the master. What are they doing to the master? The master is betrayed. And then he realized that Ostrog's attention was distracted, that Ostrog's grip had relaxed, and wrenching his arms free, he struggled to his knees. In another moment, he had thrust Ostrog back, and he was on one foot, his hand gripping Ostrog's throat, and Ostrog's hands clutching the silk about his neck. But now men were coming towards them from the dais, men whose intentions he misunderstood. He had a glimpse of someone running in the distance towards the curtains of the antechamber, and then Ostrog had slipped from him, and these newcomers were upon him. To his infinite astonishment, they seized him. They obeyed the shouts of Ostrog. He was lugged a dozen yards before he realized that they were not friends, that they were dragging him towards the open panel. When he saw this, he pulled back. He tried to fling himself down. He shouted for help with all his strength, and this time there were answering cries. The grip upon his neck relaxed, and behold, in the lower corner of the rent upon the wall, first one and then a number of little black figures appeared, shouting and waving arms. They came leaping down from the gap into the light gallery that had led to the silent rooms. They ran along it, so near were they that Graham could see the weapon in their hands. Then Ostrog was shouting in his ear to the men who held him, and once more he was struggling with all his strength against their endeavors to thrust him towards the opening that yawned to receive him. "They can't come down," panted Ostrog. "They daren't fire. It's all right. We'll save him from them yet." For long minutes, as it seemed to Graham, that inglorious struggle continued. His clothes were rent in a dozen places. He was covered in dust. One hand had been trodden on. He could hear the shouts of his supporters, and once he heard shots. He could feel his strength giving way, feel his efforts wild and aimless, but no help came, and surely, irresistibly, that black, yawning opening came nearer. The pressure upon him relaxed, and he struggled up. He saw Ostrog's grey head receding and perceived that he was no longer held. He turned about and came full into a man in black. One of the green weapons crackled close to him. A drift of pungent smoke came into his face, and a steel blade flashed. The huge chambers span about him. He saw a man in pale blue stabbing one of the black and yellow attendants not 3 yards from his face. Then hands were upon him again. He was being pulled in 2 directions now. It seemed as though people were shouting to him. He wanted to understand and could not. Someone was clutching about his thighs. He was being hoisted in spite of his vigorous efforts. He understood suddenly. He ceased to struggle. He was being lifted up on men's shoulders and carried away from that devouring panel. 10,000 throats were cheering. He saw men in blue and black hurrying after the retreating Ostrogites and firing. Lifted up, he saw now across the whole expanse of the hall beneath the Atlas image, saw that he was being carried towards the raised platform in the center of the place. The far end of the hall was already full of people running towards him. They were looking at him and cheering. He became aware that a bodyguard surrounded him. Active men about him shouted vague orders. He saw close at hand the black-mustached man in yellow who had been among those who greeted him in the public theater, shouting directions. The hall was already densely packed with swaying people. The little metal galleries sagged with a shouting load. The curtains at the end had been torn away, and the antechamber was revealed densely crowded. He could scarcely make the man near him hear for the tumult about them. "Where has Ostrog gone?" he asked. The man he questioned pointed over the heads towards the lower panels about the hall on the side opposite the gap. They stood open, and armed men, blue-clad with black sashes, were running through them and vanishing into the chambers and passages beyond. It seemed to Graham that a sound of firing drifted through the riot. He was carried in a staggering curve across the great hall towards an opening beneath the gap. He perceived men working with a sort of rude discipline to keep the crowd off him, to make a space clear about him. He passed out of the hall and saw a crude, new wall rising blankly before him, topped by blue sky. He was swung down to his feet. Someone gripped his arm and guided him. He found the man in yellow close at hand. They were taking him up a narrow stairway of brick, and close at hand rose the great red painted masses, the cranes and levers, and the still engines of the big building machine. He was at the top of the steps. He was hurried across a narrow-railed footway, and suddenly, with a vast shouting, the amphitheater of ruins opened again before him. "The master is with us! The master! The master!" The shout swept athwart the lake of faces like a wave, broke against the distant cliff of ruins, and came back in a welter of cries. "The master is on our side!" Graham perceived that he was no longer encompassed by people, that he was standing upon a little temporary platform of white metal, part of a flimsy-seeming scaffolding that laced about the great mass of the council house. Over all the huge expanse of the ruins swayed and eddied the shouting people, and here and there the black banners of the revolutionary societies ducked and swayed and formed rare nuclei of organization in the chaos. Up the steep stairs of wall and scaffolding by which his rescuers had reached the opening in the Atlas chamber clung a solid crowd, and little energetic black figures clinging to pillars and projections were strenuous to induce these congested masses to stir. Behind him, at a higher point on the scaffolding, a number of men struggled upwards with the flapping folds of a huge black standard. Through the yawning gap in the walls below him, he could look down upon the packed, attentive multitudes of the Hall of the Atlas. The distant flying stages to the south came out bright and vivid, brought nearer, as it seemed, by an unusual translucency in the air. A solitary monoplane beat up from the central stage as if to meet the coming aeroplanes. "What has become of Ostrog?" asked Graham, and even as he spoke he saw that all eyes were turned from him towards the crest of the council house building. He looked also in this direction of universal attention. For a moment he saw nothing but the jagged corner of a wall, hard and clear against the sky. Then, in the shadow, he perceived the interior of a room, and recognized with a start the green and white decorations of his former prison. And coming quickly across this open room and up to the very verge of the cliff of the ruins came a little white-clad figure, followed by two other smaller-seeming figures in black and yellow. He heard the man beside him exclaim "Ostrog" and turned to ask a question, but he never did, because of the startled exclamation of another of those who were with him and a lank finger suddenly pointing. He looked, and behold, the monoplane that had risen from the flying stage when last he had looked in that direction was driving towards them. The swift, steady flight was still novel enough to hold his attention. Nearer it came, growing rapidly larger and larger until it had swept over the further edge of the ruins and into view of the dense multitudes below. It drooped across the space and rose and passed overhead, rising to clear the mass of the council house. A filmy, translucent shape, with the solitary aeronaut peering down through its ribs, it vanished beyond the skyline of the ruins. Graham transferred his attention to Ostrog. He was signaling with his hands, and his attendants were busy breaking down the wall beside him. In another moment the monoplane came into view again, a little thing far away, coming round in a wide curve and going slower. Then suddenly the man in yellow shouted, "What are they doing? What are the people doing? Why is Ostrog left there? Why is he not captured? They will lift him. The monoplane will lift him. Ah!" The exclamation was echoed by a shout from the ruins. The rattling sound of the green weapons drifted across the intervening gulf to Graham, and looking down he saw a number of black and yellow uniforms running along one of the galleries that lay open to the air, the promontory upon which Ostrog stood. They fired as they ran at men unseen, and then emerged a number of pale blue figures in suit. These minute fighting figures had the oddest effect. They seemed as they ran like little model soldiers in a toy. This queer appearance of a house cut open gave that struggle amidst furniture and passages a quality of unreality. It was perhaps 200 yards away from him, and very nearly 50 above the heads in the ruins below. The black and yellow men ran into an open archway and turned and fired a volley. One of the blue pursuers, striding forward close to the edge, flung up his arms, staggered sideways, seemed to Graham's senses to hang over the edge for several seconds, and fell headlong down. Graham saw him strike a projecting corner, fly out head over heels, and vanish behind the red arm of the building machine. And then a shadow came between Graham and the sun. He looked up, and the sky was clear, but he knew the little monoplane had passed. Ostrog had vanished. The man in yellow thrust before him, zealous and perspiring, pointing and blatant. "They are grounding," cried the man in yellow. "They are grounding. Tell the people to fire at him. Tell them to fire at him." Graham could not understand. He heard loud voices repeating these enigmatical orders. Suddenly he saw the prow of the monoplane come gliding over the edge of the ruins and stop with a jerk. In a moment, Graham understood that the thing had grounded in order that Ostrog might escape by it. He saw a blue haze climbing out of the gulf, perceived that the people below him were now firing up at the projecting stem. A man beside him cheered hoarsely, and he saw that the blue rebels had gained the archway that had been contested by the men in black and yellow a moment before, and were running in a continual stream along the open passage. And suddenly the monoplane slipped over the edge of the council house and fell like a diving swallow. It dropped, tilting at an angle of 45 degrees so steeply that it seemed perhaps to most of those below that it could not possibly rise again. It fell so closely past him that he could see Ostrog clutching the guides of the seat, with his gray hair streaming, see the white-faced aeronaut wrenching over the lever that turned the machine upward. He heard the apprehensive vague cry of innumerable men below. Graham clutched the railing before him and gasped. The second seemed an age. The lower vane of the monoplane passed within an ace of touching the people, who yelled and screamed and trampled one another below. And then it rose. For a moment, it looked as if it could not possibly clear the opposite cliff, and then that it could not possibly clear the windwheel that rotated beyond. And behold, it was clear and soaring, still heeling sideways, upward into the windswept sky. The suspense of the moment gave place to a fury of exasperation as the swarming people realized that Ostrog had escaped them. With belated activity, they renewed their fire until the rattling wove into a roar, until the whole area became dim and blue and the air pungent with the thin smoke of their weapons. Too late, the flying machine dwindled smaller and smaller and curved about and swept gracefully downward to the flying stage from which it had so lately risen. Ostrog had escaped. For a while, a confused babblement arose from the ruin, and then the universal attention came back to Graham, perched high among the scaffolding. He saw the faces of the people turn towards him, heard their shouts at his rescue. From the throat of the ways came the song of the revolt spreading like a breeze across the swaying sea of men. The little group of men about him shouted congratulations on his escape. The man in yellow was close to him with a set face and shining eyes. And the song was rising, louder and louder, tramp, 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 tramp. Slowly, the realization came to the full meaning of these things to him, the perception of the swift change in his position. Ostrog, who had stood beside him whenever he had faced that shouting multitude before, was beyond there, the antagonist. There was no one to rule for him any longer. Even the people about him, the leaders and organizers of the multitude, looked to see what he would do, looked to him to act, awaited his orders. He was king indeed, his puppet reign was at an end. He was very intent to do the thing that was expected of him. His nerves and muscles were quivering, his mind was perhaps a little confused, but he felt neither fear nor anger. His hand that had been trodden upon was throbbing and was hot. He was a little nervous about his bearing. He knew he was not afraid, but he was anxious not to seem afraid. In his former life, he had often been more excited in playing games of skill. He was desirous of immediate action. He knew he must not think too much in detail of the huge complexity of the struggle about him, lest he should be paralyzed by the sense of its intricacy. Over there, those square blue shapes, the flying stages, meant Ostrog. Against Ostrog, who was so clear and definite and decisive, he who was so vague and undecided was fighting for the whole future of the world. Chapter 23. Graham speaks his word. For a time, the master of the earth was not even master of his own mind. Even his will seemed a will not his own. His own acts surprised him, and were but a part of the confusion of strange experiences that poured across his being. These things were definite. The Negroes were coming. Helen Wotton had warned the people of their coming, and he was master of the earth. Each of these facts seemed struggling for complete possession of his thoughts. They protruded from a background of swarming halls, elevated passages, rooms jammed with ward leaders and council, kinematograph and telephone rooms, and windows looking out on a seething sea of marching men. The men in yellow, and men whom he fancied were called ward leaders, were either propelling him forward or following him obediently. It was hard to tell. Perhaps they were doing a little of both. Perhaps some power unseen and unsuspected propelled them all. He was aware that he was going to make a proclamation to the people of the earth, aware of certain grandiose phrases floating in his mind as the thing he meant to say. Many little things happened, and then he found himself with the man in yellow entering a little room where this proclamation was to be made. This room was grotesquely latter-day in its appointments. In the center was a bright oval lit by shaded electric lights from above. The rest was in shadow, and the double finely fitting doors through which he came from the swarming hall of the Atlas made the place very still. The dead thud of these, as they closed behind him, the sudden cessation of the tumult in which he had been living for hours, the quivering circle of light, The whisper and quick, noiseless movements of vaguely visible attendants in the shadows had a strange effect upon Graham. The huge ears of a phonographic mechanism gaped in a battery for his words. The black eyes of great photographic cameras awaited his beginning. Beyond metal rods and coils glittered dimly, and something whirled about with a droning hum. He walked into the center of the light, and his shadow drew together black and sharp to a little blot at his feet. The vague shape of the thing he meant to say was already in his mind, but this silence, this isolation, the withdrawal from that contagious crowd, this audience of gaping, glaring machines had not been in his anticipation. All his supports seemed withdrawn together. He seemed to have dropped into this suddenly to have discovered himself. In a moment he was changed. He found that he now feared to be inadequate. He feared to be theatrical. He feared the quality of his voice, the quality of his wit. Astonished, he turned to the man in yellow with a propitiatory gesture. For a moment he said, "I must wait. I did not think it would be like this. I must think of the thing I have to say." While he was still hesitating, there came an agitated messenger with news that the foremost aeroplanes were passing over Madrid. "What news of the flying stages?" he asked. "The people of the southwest wards are ready." "Ready?" He turned impatiently to the blank circles of the lenses again. "I suppose it must be a sort of speech. Would to God I knew certainly the thing that should be said. Aeroplanes at Madrid. They must have started before the main fleet." "Oh, what can it matter whether I speak well or ill?" he said, and felt the light grow brighter. He had framed some vague sentence of democratic sentiment when suddenly doubts overwhelmed him. His belief in his heroic quality and calling, he found, had altogether lost its assured conviction. The picture of a little strutting futility in a windy waste of incomprehensible destinies replaced it. Abruptly, it was perfectly clear to him that this revolt against Ostrog was premature, foredoomed to failure. The impulse of passionate inadequacy against inevitable things. He thought of that swift flight of aeroplanes like the swoop of fate towards him. He was astonished that he could have seen things in any other light. In that final emergency he debated, thrust debate resolutely aside, determined at all costs to go through with the thing he had undertaken, and he could find no word to begin. Even as he stood, awkward, hesitating, with an indiscreet apology for his inability trembling on his lips, came the noise of many people crying out, the running to and fro of feet. "Wait!" cried someone, and a door opened. Graham turned, and the watching lights waned. Through the open doorway, he saw a slight girlish figure approaching. His heart leapt. It was Helen Wotton. The man in yellow came out of the nearer shadows into the circle of light. "This is the girl who told us what Ostrog had done," he said. She came in very quietly and stood still, as if she did not want to interrupt Graham's eloquence. But his doubts and questionings fled before her presence. He remembered the things that he had meant to say. He faced the cameras again, and the light about him grew brighter. He turned back to her. "You have helped me," he said lamely. "Helped me very much. This is very difficult." He paused. He addressed himself to the unseen multitudes who stared upon him with those grotesque black eyes. At first, he spoke slowly. "Men and women of the new age," he said, "you have arisen to do battle for the race. There is no easy victory before us." He stopped to gather words. He wished passionately for the gift of moving speech. "This night is a beginning," he said. "This battle that is coming, this battle that rushes upon us tonight is only a beginning. All your lives, it may be, you must fight. Take no thought. Though I am beaten, though I am utterly overthrown, I think I may be overthrown." He found the thing in his mind too vague for words. He paused momentarily and broke into vague exhortations. And then a rush of speech came upon him. Much that he said was but the humanitarian commonplace of a vanished age, but the conviction of his voice touched it to vitality. He stated the case of the old days to the people of the new age, to the girl at his side. "I come out of the past to you," he said, "with the memory of an age that hoped. My age was an age of dreams, of beginnings, an age of noble hopes. Throughout the world we have made an end of slavery. Throughout the world we have spread the desire and anticipation that wars might cease, that all men and women might live nobly, in freedom and in peace. So we hoped in the days that are past. And what of those hopes? How is it with man after 200 years? Great cities, vast powers, a collective greatness beyond our dreams. For that we did not work, and that has come. But how is it with the little lives that make up this greater life? How is it with the common lives? As it has ever been, sorrow and labor, lives cramped and unfulfilled, lives tempted by power, tempted by wealth, and gone to waste and folly. The old faiths have faded and changed. The new faith, is there a faith? Charity and mercy, he floundered, beauty and the love of beautiful things, effort and devotion. Give yourselves as I would give myself, as Christ gave himself upon the cross. It does not matter if you understand. It does not matter if you seem to fail. You know, in the core of your hearts you know. There is no promise, there is no security, nothing to go upon but faith. There is no faith but faith, faith which is courage. Things that he had long wished to believe, he found that he believed. He spoke gustily in broken, incomplete sentences with all his heart and strength of this new faith within him. He spoke of the greatness of self-abnegation, of his belief in an immortal life of humanity in which we live and move and have our being. His voice rose and fell, and the recording appliances hummed as he spoke. Dim attendants watched him out of the shadow. His sense of that silent spectator beside him sustained his sincerity. For a few moments, he was carried away. He felt no doubt of his heroic quality, no doubt of his heroic words. He had it all straight and plain. His eloquence limped no longer, and at last he made an end to speaking. Here and now, he cried, I make my will. All that is mine in the world I give to the people of the world. All that is mine in the world I give to the people of the world. To all of you, I give it to you, and myself I give to you. And as God wills tonight, I will live for you or I will die. He ended. He found the light of his present exaltation reflected in the face of the girl. Their eyes met, and her eyes were swimming with tears of enthusiasm. I knew, she whispered, O Father of the world, sire, I knew you would say these things. I have said what I could, he answered lamely, and grasped and clung to her outstretched hands. Chapter 24. While the aeroplanes were coming. The man in yellow was beside them. Neither had noted his coming. He was saying that the southwest wards were marching. I never expected it so soon, he cried. They have done wonders. You must send them a word to help them on their way. Graham stared at him absent-mindedly. Then with a start, he returned to his previous occupation about the flying stages. Yes, he said, that is good, that is good. He weighed a message. Tell them, well done, Southwest. He turned his eyes to Helen Wotton again. His face expressed his struggle between conflicting ideas. We must capture the flying stages, he explained. Unless we can do that, they will land Negroes. At all costs, we must prevent that. He felt, even as he spoke, that this was not what had been in his mind before the interruption. He saw a touch of surprise in her eyes. She seemed about to speak, and a shrill bell drowned her voice. It occurred to Graham that she expected him to lead these marching people, that was the thing he had to do. He made the offer abruptly. He addressed the man in yellow, but he spoke to her. He saw her face respond. Here I am doing nothing, he said. It is impossible, protested the man in yellow. It is a fight in a warren. Your place is here. He explained elaborately. He motioned towards the room where Graham must wait. He insisted no other course was possible. We must know where you are, he said. At any moment a crisis may arise needing your presence and decision. A picture had drifted through his mind of such a vast dramatic struggle as the masses in the ruins had suggested. But here was no spectacular battlefield such as he imagined. Instead was seclusion and suspense. It was only as the afternoon wore on that he pieced together a truer picture of the fight that was raging, inaudibly and invisibly, within 4 miles of him, beneath the Roehampton stage. A strange and unprecedented contest it was, a battle that was 100,000 little battles, a battle in a sponge of ways and channels, fought out of sight of sky or sun under the electric glare, fought out in a vast confusion by multitudes untrained in arms, led chiefly by acclamation, multitudes dulled by mindless labor and enervated by the tradition of 200 years of servile security against multitudes demoralized by lives of venial privilege and sensual indulgence. They had no artillery, no differentiation into this force or that. The only weapon on either side was the little green metal carbine, whose secret manufacture and sudden distribution in enormous quantities had been one of Ostrog's culminating moves against the council. Few had had any experience with this weapon. Many had never discharged one. Many who carried it came unprovided with ammunition. Never was wilder firing in the history of warfare. It was a battle of amateurs, a hideous experimental warfare, armed rioters fighting armed rioters swept forward by the words and fury of a song, by the tramping sympathy of their numbers, pouring in countless myriads towards the smaller ways, the disabled lifts, the galleries slippery with blood, the halls and passages choked with smoke beneath the flying stages, to learn there, when retreat was hopeless, the ancient mysteries of warfare. And overhead, save for a few sharpshooters upon the roof spaces, and for a few bands and threads of vapor that multiplied and darkened towards the evening, the day was a clear serenity. Ostrog, it seemed, had no bombs to command, and in all the earlier phases of the battle, the flying machines played no part. Not the smallest cloud was there to break the empty brilliance of the sky. It seemed as though it held itself vacant until the aeroplane should come. Ever and again there was news of these drawing nearer, from this Spanish town and then that, and then presently from France. But of the new guns that Ostrog had made and which were known to be in the city came no news in spite of Graham's urgency, nor any report of successes from the dense felt of fighting strands about the flying stages. Section after section of the labor societies reported itself assembled, reported itself marching, and vanished from knowledge into the labyrinth of that warfare. What was happening there? Even the busy ward leaders did not know. In spite of the opening and closing of doors, the hasty messengers, the ringing of bells, and the perpetual clitter-clack of recording implements, Graham felt isolated, strangely inactive and inoperative. His isolation seemed at times the strangest, the most unexpected of all the things that had happened since his awakening. It had something of the quality of that inactivity that comes in dreams, a tumult, the stupendous realization of a world struggle between Ostrog and himself. And then, this confined quiet little room with its mouthpieces and bells and broken mirror. Now the door would be closed and Graham and Helen were alone together. They seemed sharply marked off then from all the unprecedented world storm that rushed together without, vividly aware of one another, only concerned with one another. Then the door would open again, messengers would enter, or a sharp bell would stab their quiet privacy, and it was like a window in a well-built, brightly lit house flung open suddenly like a hurricane. The dark hurry and tumult, the stress and vehemence of the battle rushed in and overwhelmed them. They were no longer persons, but mere spectators, mere impressions of a tremendous convulsion. They became unreal even to themselves, miniatures of personality, indescribably small, and the two antagonistic realities, the only realities in being, were first the city that throbbed and roared yonder in a belated frenzy of defense, and secondly the aeroplanes, hurling inexorably towards them over the round shoulder of the world. There came a sudden stir outside, a running to and fro, and cries. The girl stood up, speechless, incredulous. Metallic voices were shouting, "Victory!" Yes, it was victory. Bursting through the curtains appeared the man in yellow, startled and disheveled with excitement. "Victory!" he cried. "Victory! The people are winning! Ostrog's people have collapsed!" She rose. "Victory? What do you mean?" asked Graham. "Tell me, what?" "We have driven them out of the under galleries at Norwood. Streatham is afire and burning wildly, and Roehampton is ours. Ours! And we have taken the monoplane that lie thereon." A shrill bell rang. An agitated, gray-headed man appeared from the room of the ward leaders. "It is all over," he cried. "What matters it now that we have Roehampton? The aeroplanes have been sighted at Boulogne." "The channel," said the man in yellow. He calculated swiftly. "Half an hour." "They still have 3 of the flying stages," said the old man. "Those guns?" cried Graham. "We cannot mount them in half an hour." "Do you mean they are found?" "Too late," said the old man. "If we could stop them another hour," cried the man in yellow. "Nothing could stop them now," said the old man. "They have near 100 aeroplanes in the first fleet." "Another hour?" asked Graham. "To be so near," said the ward leader, "now that we have found those guns, to be so near if once we could get them out upon the roof spaces." "How long would that take?" asked Graham suddenly. "An hour, certainly." "Too late," cried the ward leader. "Too late." "Is it too late?" said Graham. "Even now, an hour." He had suddenly perceived a possibility. He tried to speak calmly, but his face was white. "There is a chance. You said there was a monoplane?" "On the Roehampton stage, sire." "Smashed?" "No, it is lying crossways to the carrier. It must be got upon the guides easily, but there is no aeronaut." Graham glanced at the 2 men and then at Helen. He spoke after a long pause. "We have no aeronauts?" "None." He turned to Helen. His decision was made. "I must do it." "Do what?" "Go to this flying stage, to this machine." "What do you mean?" I am an aeronaut after all. Those days for which you reproached me were not altogether wasted. He turned to the old man in yellow. Tell them to put it upon the gods. The man in yellow hesitated. What do you mean to do? Cried Helen. This monoplane, it is a chance. You don't mean... To fight? Yes, to fight in the air. I have thought before. A big aeroplane is a clumsy thing. A resolute man. But never since flying began, cried the man in yellow. There has been no need, but now the time has come. Tell them now, send them my message, to put it upon the gods. I see now something to do. I see now why I am here. The old man dumbly interrogated the man in yellow, nodded, and hurried out. Helen made a step towards Graham. Her face was white. But sire, how can one fight? You will be killed. Perhaps yet not to do it, or to let someone else attempt it. You will be killed, she repeated. I've said my word. Do you not see? It may save London. He stopped. He could speak no more. He swept the alternative aside by a gesture, and they stood looking at one another. They were both clear that he must go. There was no step back from these towering heroisms. Her eyes brimmed with tears. She came towards him with a curious movement of her hands, as though she felt her way and could not see. She seized his hand and kissed it. To wake, she cried, for this. He held her clumsily for a moment, and kissed the hair of her bowed head, and then thrust her away and turned towards the man in yellow. He could not speak. The gesture of his arm said onward. Chapter 25. The Coming of the Aeroplanes. Two men in pale blue were lying in the irregular line that stretched along the edge of the captured Roehampton stage from end to end, grasping their carbines and peering into the shadows of the stage called Wimbledon Park. Now and then they spoke to one another. They spoke the mutilated English of their class and period. The fire of the Ostrogites had dwindled and ceased, and few of the enemy had been seen for some time. But the echoes of the fight that was going on now far below in the lower galleries of that stage came every now and then between the staccato of shots from the popular side. One of these men was describing to the other how he had seen a man down below there dodge behind a girder, and had aimed at a guest and hit him cleanly as he dodged too far. He's down there still, said the marksman. See that little patch? Yes, between those bars. A few yards behind them lay a dead stranger, face upward to the sky, with the blue canvas of his jacket smoldering in a circle about the neat bullet hole in his chest. Close behind him, a wounded man, with the legs swathed about, sat with an expressionless face and watched the progress of that burning. Behind them, athwart the carrier, lay the captured monoplane. I can't see him now, said the second man in a tone of provocation. The marksman became foul-mouthed and high-voiced in his earnest endeavor to make things plain, and suddenly, interrupting him, came a noisy shouting from the substage. What's going on now? He said, and raised himself on one arm to survey the stairheads in the central groove of the stage. A number of blue figures were coming up these and swarming across the stage. We don't want all these fools, said his friend. They only crowd up and spoil shots. What are they after? Shh, they're shouting something. The two men listened. The newcomers had crowded densely about the machine. 3 ward leaders, conspicuous by their black mantles and badges, clambered into the body and appeared above it. The rank and file flung themselves upon the vans, gripping hold of the edges until the entire outline of the thing was manned. In some spaces 3 feet deep, one of the marksmen knelt up. They're putting on the courier. It's what they're after. He rose to his feet. His friend rose also. What's the good, said his friend. We've got no aeronauts. That's what they're doing anyhow. He looked at his rifle, looked at the struggling crowd, and suddenly turned to the wounded man. Mind these, mate, he said, handing his carbine and cartridge belt, and in a moment he was running towards the monoplane. For a quarter of an hour he was lugging, thrusting, shouting, and heeding shouts, and then the thing was done, and he stood with a multitude of others, cheering their own achievement. By this time he knew what everyone indeed in the city knew, that the master, raw learner that he was, intended to fly this machine himself, was coming even now to take control of it, would let no other man attempt it. He who takes the greatest danger, he who bears the heaviest burden, that man is king. So the master was reported to have spoken. And even as this man cheered, and while the beads of sweat still chased one another from the disorder of his hair, he heard the thunder of a greater tumult, and in fitful snatches the beat and impulse of the revolutionary song. He saw through a gap in the people that a thick stream of heads still poured upon the stairway. The master is coming, shouted voices. The master is coming. and the crowd about him grew denser and denser. He began to thrust himself towards the central groove. "The master is coming! The sleeper, the master! God and the master!" roared the voices. And suddenly, quite close to him were the black uniforms of the Revolutionary Guard, and for the first and last time in his life he saw Graham, saw him quite nearly. A tall, dark man in a flowing black robe he was, with a white, resolute face and eyes fixed steadfastly before him. A man who, for all the little things about him, had neither eyes, nor ears, nor thoughts. For all his days that man remembered the passing of Graham's bloodless face. In a moment it had gone, and he was fighting in the swaying crowd. A lad weeping with terror thrust against him, pressed towards the stairways, yelling, "Clear for the start, you fools!" The bell that cleared the flying stage became a loud, unmelodious clanging. With that clanging in his ears, Graham drew near the monoplane, marched into the shadow of its tilting wing. He became aware that a number of people about him were offering to accompany him, and waved their offers aside. He wanted to think how one started the engine. The bell clanged faster and faster, and the feet of the retreating people roared faster and faster. The man in yellow was assisting him to mount through the ribs of the body. He clambered into the aeronaut's place, fixing himself very carefully and deliberately. What was it? The man in yellow was pointing to two small flying machines driving upward in the southern sky. No doubt they were looking for the coming aeroplanes. That, presently, the thing to do now was to start. Things were being shouted at him, questions, warnings. They bothered him. He wanted to think about the machine, to recall every item of his previous experience. He waved the people from him, saw the man in yellow dropping off through the ribs, saw the crowd cleft down the line of the girders by his gesture. For a moment he was motionless, staring at the levers, the wheel by which the engine shifted, and all the delicate appliances of which he knew so little. His eye caught a spirit level with the bubble towards him, and he remembered something, spent a dozen seconds in swinging the engine forward until the bubble floated in the center of the tube. He noted that the people were not shouting, knew they watched his deliberation. A bullet smashed on the bar above his head. Who fired? Was the line clear of people? He stood up to see and sat down again. In another second, the propeller was spinning and he was rushing down the guides. He gripped the wheel and swung the engine back to lift the stem. Then it was the people shouted. In a moment, he was throbbing with the quiver of the engine, and the shouts dwindled swiftly behind, rushed down to silence. The wind whistled over the edges of the screen, and the world sank away from him very swiftly. Throb, 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 up he drove. He fancied himself free of all excitement, felt cool and deliberate. He lifted the stem still more, opened one valve on his left wing, and swept round and up. He looked down with a steady hand and up. One of the Ostrogite monoplanes was driving across his course, so that he drove obliquely towards it and would pass below it at a steep angle. Its little aeronauts were peering down at him. What did they mean to do? His mind became active. One he saw held a weapon pointing, seeming prepared to fire. What did they think he meant to do? In a moment he understood their tactics, and his resolution was taken. His momentary lethargy was past. He opened two more valves to his left, swung round, end on to this hostile machine, closed his valves and shot straight at it, stem and windscreen shielding him from the shot. They tilted a little as if to clear him. He flung up his stem. Throb, 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 pause. Throb, throb, he set his teeth, his face into an involuntary grimace, and crash! He struck it. He struck upward beneath the nearer wing. Very slowly the wing of his antagonist seemed to broaden as the impetus of his blow turned it up. He saw the full breadth of it, and then it slid downward out of his sight. He felt his stem going down, his hands tightening on the levers, whirled and rammed the engine back. He felt the jerk of a clearance. The nose of the machine jerked upward steeply, and for a moment he seemed to be lying on his back. The machine was reeling and staggering. It seemed to be dancing on its screw. He made a huge effort, hung for a moment on the levers, and slowly the engine came forward again. He was driving upward, but no longer so steeply. He gasped for a moment and flung himself at the levers again. The wind whistled about him. One further effort, and he was almost level. He could breathe. He turned his head for the first time to see what had become of his antagonists, turned back to the levers for a moment and looked again. For a moment, he could have believed they were annihilated. Then he saw between the two stages to the east was a chasm, and down this something, a slender edge, fell swiftly and vanished as a sixpence falls down a crack. At first he did not understand, and then a wild joy possessed him. He shouted at the top of his voice, an inarticulate shout, and drove higher and higher up the sky. Throb, 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 pause. Throb, throb, throb. Where was the other? He thought. They took... As he looked around the empty heavens, he had a momentary fear that this second machine had risen above him, and then he saw it alighting on the norward stage. They had meant shooting. To risk being rammed headlong 2,000 feet in the air was beyond their latter-day courage. For a little while he circled, then swooped in a steep descent towards the westward stage. Throb, 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 throb. The twilight was creeping on apace. The smoke from the streetum stage, that had been so dense and dark, was now a pillar of fire, and all the laced curves of the moving ways and the translucent roofs and domes and the chasms between the buildings were glowing softly now, lit by the tempered radiance of the electric lights that the glare of the day overpowered. The 3 efficient stages that the Ostrogites held, for Wimbledon Park was useless because of the fire from Roehampton, and Streatham was a furnace, were glowing with guide lights for the coming aeroplanes. As he swept over the Roehampton stage, he saw the dark masses of the people thereon. He heard a clap of frantic cheering, heard a bullet from the Wimbledon Park stage tweet through the air, and went beating above the Surrey wastes. He felt a breath of wind from the southwest and lifted his westward wing as he had learnt to do, and so drove upward, heeling into the rare swift upper air. Whir, whir, whir. Up he drove and up to that pulsating rhythm until the country beneath was blue and indistinct, and London spread like a little map traced in light. Like the mere model of a city near the brim of the horizon, the southwest was a sky of sapphire over the shadowy rim of the world, and ever as he drove upward, the multitude of stars increased. And behold, in the southward, low down and glittering swiftly nearer, were 2 little patches of nebulous light, and then 2 more, and then a glow of swiftly driving shapes. Presently he could count them. There were 24. The first fleet of aeroplanes had come. Beyond appeared a yet greater glow. He swept round in a half circle, staring at his advancing fleet. It flew in a wedge-like shape, a triangular flight of gigantic phosphorescent shapes sweeping nearer through the lower air. He made a swift calculation of their pace and spun the little wheel that brought the engine forward. He touched a lever, and the throbbing effort of the engine ceased. He began to fall, fell swifter and swifter. He aimed at the apex of the wedge. He dropped like a stone through the whistling air. It seemed scarce a second from that soaring moment before he struck the foremost aeroplane. No man of all that black multitude saw the coming of his fate. No man among them dreamt of the hawk that struck downward upon him out of the sky. Those who were not limp in the agonies of air sickness were craning their blank necks and staring to see the filmy city that was rising out of the haze. The rich and splendid city to which Massa Boss had brought their obedient muscles. Bright teeth gleamed and the glossy faces shone. They had heard of Paris. They knew they were to have lordly times among the poor white trash. Suddenly Graham hit them. He had aimed at the body of the aeroplane, but at the very last instant a better idea had flashed into his mind. He twisted about and struck near the edge of the starboard wing with all his accumulated weight. He was jerked back as he struck. His prow went gliding across its smooth expanse towards the rim. He felt the forward rush of the huge fabric sweeping him, and his monoplane along with it, and for a moment that seemed like an age he could not tell what was happening. He heard 1,000 throats yelling, and perceived that his machine was balanced on the edge of a gigantic float, and driving down, down, glanced over his shoulder and saw the backbone of the aeroplane and the opposite float swaying up. He had a vision through the ribs of sliding chairs, staring faces, and hands clutching at the tilting guide bars. The fenestrations in the further float flashed open as the aeronaut tried to right her. Beyond, he saw a second aeroplane leaping steeply to escape the whirl of its heeling fellow. The broad area of swaying wings seemed to jerk upward. He felt he had dropped clear, that the monstrous fabric, clean overturned, hung like a sloping wall above him. He did not clearly understand that he had struck the side float of the aeroplane and slipped off, but he perceived that he was flying free on the downglide and rapidly nearing Earth. What had he done? His heart throbbed like a noisy engine in his throat, and for a perilous instant he could not move his levers because of the paralysis of his hands. He wrenched the levers to throw his engine back, fought for 2 seconds against the weight of it, felt himself righting, driving horizontally, set the engine beating again. He looked upward and saw two aeroplanes glide shouting far overhead, looked back and saw the main body of the fleet opening out and rushing upward and outward, saw the one he had struck fall edgewise on and strike like a gigantic knife blade along the wind wheels below. He put down his stern and looked again. He drove up heedless of his direction as he watched. He saw the wind vanes give, saw the huge fabric strike the earth, saw its downward vanes crumple with the weight of its descent, and then the whole mass turned over and smashed upside down upon the sloping wheels. Then from the heaving wreckage a thin tongue of white fire licked up towards the zenith. He was aware of a huge mass flying through the air towards him, and turned upwards just in time to escape the charge, if it was a charge, of a second aeroplane. It whirled by below, sucked him down a fathom, and nearly turned him over in the gust of its close passage. He became aware of three others rushing towards him, aware of the urgent necessity of beating above them. The aeroplanes were all about him, circling wildly to avoid him, it seemed. They drove past him, above, below, eastward and westward. Far away to the westward was the sound of collision and two falling flares. Far away to the southward a second squadron was coming. Steadily he beat upward. Presently all the aeroplanes were below him. But for a moment he doubted the height he had of them, and did not swoop again. And then he came down upon a second victim, and all its load of soldiers saw him coming. The big machine heeled and swayed as the fear-maddened men scrambled to the stern for their weapons. A score of bullets sung through the air, and there flashed a star in the thick glass windscreen that protected him. The aeroplane slowed and dropped to foil his stroke, and dropped too low. Just in time he saw the wind wheels of Bromley Hill rushing up towards him, and spun about and up as the aeroplane he had chased crashed among them. All its voices wove into a felt of yelling. The great fabric seemed to be standing on end for a second among the heeling and splintering vans, and then it flew to pieces. Huge splinters came flying through the air. Its engines burst like shells. A hot rush of flame shot overhead into the darkling sky. "Two," he cried, with a bomb from overhead bursting as it fell, and forthwith he was beating up again. A glorious exhilaration possessed him. Now, a giant activity. His troubles about humanity, about his inadequacy, were gone forever. He was a man in battle rejoicing in his power. Aeroplanes seemed radiating from him in every direction, intent only upon avoiding him. The yelling of their packed passengers came in short gusts as they swept by. He chose his third quarry, struck hastily, and did but turn it on edge. It escaped him to smash against the tall cliff of London Wall. Flying from that impact, he skimmed the darkling ground so nearly he could see a frightened rabbit bolting up a slope. He jerked up steeply and found himself driving over South London with the air about him vacant. To the right of him, a wild riot of signal rockets from the Ostrogites banged tumultuously in the sky. To the south, the wreckage of half a dozen airships flamed, and east and west and north they fled before him. They drove away to the east and north and went about in the south, for they could not pause in the air. In their present confusion, any attempt at evolution would have meant disastrous collisions. He passed 200 feet or so above the Roehampton stage. It was black with people and noisy with their frantic shouting, but why was the Wimbledon Park stage black and cheering too? The smoke and flame of Streatham now hid the three further stages. He curved about and rose to see them and the northern quarters. First came the square masses of Shooter's Hill into sight from behind the smoke, lit and orderly with the aeroplane that had landed and its disembarking Negroes. Then came Blackheath, and then under the corner of the reek, the Norwood stage. In Blackheath no aeroplane had landed. Norwood was covered by a swarm of little figures running to and fro in a passionate confusion. Why? Abruptly he understood. The stubborn defense of the flying stages was over. The people were pouring out into the underways of these last strongholds of Ostrog's usurpation. And then from far away on the northern border of the city, full of glorious import to him, came a sound, a signal, a note of triumph, the leaden thud of a gun. His lips fell apart, his face was disturbed with emotion. He drew an immense breath. "They win!" he shouted to the open air. "The people win!" The sound of a second gun came like an answer, and then he saw the monoplane on Blackheath running down its guides to launch. It lifted clean and rose. It shot up into the air, driving straight southward and away from him. In an instant, it came to him what this meant. It must needs be Ostrog in flight. He shouted and dropped towards it. He had the momentum of his elevation and fell slanting down the air and very swiftly. It rose steeply at his approach. He allowed for its velocity and drove straight upon it. It suddenly became a mere flat edge, and behold, he was past it, and driving headlong down with all the force of his futile blow. He was furiously angry. He reeled the engine back along its shaft and went circling up. He saw Ostrog's machine beating up a spiral before him. He rose straight towards it, one above it, by virtue of the impetus of his swoop, and by the advantage and weight of a man. He dropped headlong, dropped and missed again. As he rushed past, he saw the face of Ostrog's aeronaut, confident and cool, and in Ostrog's attitude a wincing resolution. Ostrog was looking steadfastly away from him to the south. He realized with a gleam of wrath how bungling his flight must be. Below he saw the Croydon hills. He jerked upward, and once more he gained on his enemy. He glanced over his shoulder, and his attention was arrested. The eastward stage, the one on Shooter's Hill, appeared to lift, a flash changing to a tall gray shape. A cowled figure of smoke and dust jerked into the air. For a moment this cowled figure stood motionless, dropping huge masses of metal from its shoulders, and then it began to uncoil a dense head of smoke. The people had blown it up, aeroplane and all, as suddenly a second flashing gray shape sprang up from the Norwood stage. And even as he stared at this came a dead report, and the airwave of the first explosion struck him. He was flung up and sideways. For a moment his monoplane fell nearly edgewise with her nose down, and seemed to hesitate whether to overset altogether. He stood on his windshield, wrenching the wheel that swayed up over his head, and then the shock of the second explosion took his machine sideways. He found himself clinging to one of the ribs of his machine, and the air was blowing past him and upward. He seemed to be hanging quite still in the air, with the wind blowing up past him. It occurred to him that he was falling. Then he was sure that he was falling. He could not look down. He found himself recapitulating with incredible swiftness all that had happened since his awakening. The days of doubt, the days of empire, and at last the tumultuous discovery of Ostrog's calculated treachery. The vision had a quality of utter unreality. Who was he? Why was he holding so tightly with his hands? Why could he not let go? In such a fall as this, countless dreams have ended, but in a moment he would wake. His thoughts ran swifter and swifter. He wondered if he should see Helen again. It seemed so unreasonable that he should not see her again. It must be a dream, yet surely he would meet her. She, at least, was real. She was real. He would wake and meet her. Although he could not look it, he was suddenly aware that the earth was very near. The end.